talking to family members in the holding room as they waited for the deliberations to be over. He has to be here at the court as the jury deliberates, but he was in an upbeat mood. That has turned. The verdict is now coming, and this is more than just a legal battle for former President Donald Trump. He is the first former president of the United States, any American president, to face a historic criminal trial. And this comes in the middle of a presidential campaign against President Joe Biden, whose campaign has been here in recent days in Lower Manhattan. Everything's on the line right now for Trump, the former president of the United States. Will he serve jail time if there is a guilty verdict? He could get probation, but a prison sentence is possible. And this is someone who just said minutes ago to reporters he wants to campaign. And this has already been a burden, a real political cost for him, costing him time.
Robert Costa, thank you. And we should note that the picture you are looking at right now is a live picture from right outside the courtroom where we have seen Donald Trump appear some days at the end of the trial or before to make statements about what he has called a witch hunt going on inside. Want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. We've been to places in history that we've never been before with Donald Trump, twice impeached. Now is likely to become, or could become, I should say, the first president tried in a criminal trial to either be acquitted and found not guilty or guilty. We just haven't been here before in this. What are the stakes for Donald Trump as he is the Republican Party's nominee?
Right. To pick up on Robert Costa's point, it's not just that he's a former president, Nora. He's the Republican nominee in waiting in an active presidential campaign, shadowed, as he has been for months now, by criminal indictments. We're now going to have probably the only verdict on any of the pending criminal indictments before the election. If he's acquitted, most people I've talked to in the Trump universe believe there will be a burst of energy around the former president in a very positive political way. If he's convicted, they believe, those in the Trump inner circle, that this will be convulsive for the country, because at least a third of the country, Nora, and maybe more than a third, believe this entire case should never have been brought in the first place, agree entirely with the former president's orientation to this, that others looked at this and didn't seek to prosecute this, that this is a legal reach to take a business records case, attach it to a felony in a campaign context, which has never been prosecuted before in New York. They agree with that orientation to this. And if he's convicted, those in the Trump inner circle predict a convulsive reaction. However, there will be a part of this country, Nora, that will say if the former president is convicted, there is now finally some institutional accountability for someone who has been toppling, or at least attempting to topple, all sorts of institutional norms in this country. I can't give you an assessment of the actual point-by-point, number-by-number political reaction to this, but we are in a fraught moment in American history. A lot of things hang in the balance, not just for former President Trump, but the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, President Biden, and our sense of institutional permanence and norms.
No doubt. And this is day 2 to remind everybody of the jury deliberations. And just a short time ago, we got word from the judge that a verdict was in. Judge Merchan saying the jury has a verdict, but we would like an extra 30 minutes to fill out forms if that is possible. Want to bring in a former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney and CBS News legal contributor, Rebecca Roiphe. She joins us now. And Rebecca, this 30 minutes, of course, everyone is waiting to hear what this jury has decided first. 10 hours over 2 days. The number of questions that they asked to get clarification on. What do you think that tells us about how this jury may be leaning?
You know, it's always impossible to know what a jury has decided until that verdict is actually read. However, this was an incredibly quick deliberation over 2 days. As you said, only about 10 hours of deliberation. It looks like the jury was thinking carefully about the testimony and about the elements that needed to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But, you know, generally speaking, when verdicts are rendered this quickly, it usually is a sign that is positive for the prosecution, because it normally takes far longer for 12 jurors to agree to acquit than this short amount of time. But of course, really, that is pure speculation at this point.
Let's also bring in Caroline Pelosi. She is the criminal defense attorney and a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. And Caroline, good to talk to you. Just on this matter, falsifying business records in New York, that is a misdemeanor, but can be elevated if, in fact, intent was used to conceal another crime. That's why this case is relevant, because the prosecutors made the case that there was intent, of course, a campaign finance violation. To their words, they said it could have tipped the election. What do you see that the jury has come back so quickly?
That's right. I really do agree with Rebecca. I think the swift nature of this verdict and the fact that we didn't get any other notes from jurors saying we're having trouble coming up with a unanimous verdict, something of that nature. We were bracing ourselves for something along those lines. I agree. This feels like guilty verdicts are on the way. The object crime that you're talking about there is a New York State conspiracy to violate election law, and that is by influencing an election through unlawful means. And we saw that the jurors requested rereads of testimony, David Pecker's testimony regarding that 2015 Trump Tower meeting in which the prosecution alleged this plan, this conspiracy was hatched. So I think that we are seeing sort of the pieces of the puzzle come together for that object crime, making this what was in one case a misdemeanor, now a felony crime, falsification of the records in furtherance of hiding this New York State election law conspiracy.
Any moment now, we could get the verdict in this case against Donald J. Trump, these 34 felony counts. The jury had asked for an additional 30 minutes. That time has passed, so we are on standby to find out what these 7 men and 5 women have decided in this case. There are also, we should note, 2 lawyers who are on this jury as well. Let's bring in Jan Crawford, who is our chief legal correspondent, also covers the Supreme Court. What do you see about today as we await this verdict?
Well, I mean, following up on Major's point, I think what is so extraordinary is this was kind of seen as maybe the weakest of the cases that could have been brought against former President Trump. The main case being, of course, potentially the prosecution for his attempts to overthrow the 2020 election. That case has kind of ground to a halt as it is now before the Supreme Court on whether or not he is absolutely immune from prosecution there. We're awaiting a decision from the court which could determine whether that trial will go forward. It could be potentially impossible for that prosecution. So we could be in a situation where out of all the cases, the classified documents case, the January 6th potential prosecution, in this case, this could end up being the only case against former President Trump to go to trial and potentially merit a conviction. And to Major's point, that could land in ways that we cannot possibly imagine. A former president being convicted on charges that are novel, in some cases, considered weak by many legal commentators, and multiple grounds for the president to argue on statutory and constitutional grounds that he is going to appeal this and fight it in the appellate courts.
Donald Trump and his attorneys are in the courtroom. The judge is in the courtroom. The jury is being brought in. We are just minutes or seconds away from a verdict. And of course, as soon as we know that information, we will share it with you. I think one of the key questions likely that our viewers may have, if Donald Trump is a convicted felon, he can still run for president. Does it mean he will go to jail?
We don't know, because the judge has discretion. As a matter of fact, in the closing arguments...
But he could.
Yes, he could.
I mean, that's out there on the table.
But in the closing arguments, former President Trump's lead attorney, was harshly criticized by the judge for injecting into his closing argument something that defense attorneys know they shouldn't inject, which is, you can't send a former president to jail over this. And the judge said, wait a minute, you can't talk about that. First of all, it's a discretion in my hands. And second of all, you can't talk to a jury that way in your close. But the former president's legal counsel injected that, I believe, as a safe harbor to tell the jury the stakes are so high. Tactically, I believe the jury knew that going in. The jury has known from day one the stakes are enormously high. One other point, talking about this 2015 meeting in Trump Tower. The prosecution said that's where this began, and it took on incredible relevance in the final weeks of the campaign, which I remember vividly, Nora, because I was covering it day by day, when the status of Donald Trump as the Republican Party nominee was thrown into great distress by the Access Hollywood tape and everything that flowed from that.
I think it's very important that you bring this up because people say, I don't understand why this is relevant. This relationship that they had 18 years ago, why is this coming up now again? Because it was. October was when the Access Hollywood tape came out.
Yes.
Donald Trump's team was worried that this would completely derail his chances in beating Hillary Clinton.
There were
so this
public
is the
calls
motivation to squash
and lots
stories
of
about these affairs.
behind-the-scenes conversations about, is there an alternative? Should Mike Pence become the nominee? For the one and only time in that campaign, or his presidency or his post-presidency, Donald Trump publicly apologized. He recorded what was described in gallows humor by Trump aides that time as a hostage video to say, I'm sorry for this locker room talk. That shows the depth of distress within the Trump campaign over that particular time. And the Stormy Daniels story, if it had been confirmed and verified in that real time, the Trump campaign had every reason to believe that could have been not only damaging, Nora, but potentially fatal in the closing hours, closing weeks of that campaign.
We are just moments away from a verdict in the case against Donald Trump. I want to bring in Errol Barnett, who is outside the courtroom. You can see a lot of the activity, though, where Errol is, a lot of the police activity. And Errol, remind us what some of the questions were that the jury had today in terms of clarification.
Nora, that's what's so interesting. It was yesterday, after only approximately 4 hours of deliberating, that the jurors had notes for the judge. They needed instruction from the judge on what it meant to infer something. They also wanted instructions as to how to value Michael Cohen's testimony, considering he was an accomplice to this alleged crime. They also wanted 4 additional pieces of testimony as it related to David Pecker, a close confidant, and someone who testified that he's still a friend of Trump and considers him a mentor. And they had questions about testimony relating to a Trump Tower meeting in August of 2015, which the prosecution says was the nexus, the core, the origins of a scheme to deceive the American public by suppressing negative stories about Donald Trump in the tabloids, amplifying negative stories about his opponents to effectively pave the way for him to the White House. They wanted clarification on that. And what's interesting is when the judge clarified that because Michael Cohen is an accomplice, you cannot convict based on his testimony alone unless it is corroborated by other evidence and testimony as part of the trial. Also, he clarified to them that they can infer something. Basically, he used the analogy of if it rained overnight. Even if you didn't see the rain, you can infer that it rained overnight if you can see outside your window in the morning and people have umbrellas and the pavement is wet. So even in the absence of direct fact, you can make an inference as a jury if other facts seem to suggest and reasonably line up another scenario. And so as we await to hear what the exact verdict is, we are now, I understand, inside the courtroom with jurors seated, with Donald Trump looking quite anxious. We're getting word of what the verdict is.
We are getting word on the first count that Donald Trump is guilty. Now remember, there are 34 counts that we will go through. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Count 5 and 6, guilty. Count 7, guilty. Count 8, guilty. Count 9, guilty. Count 10, guilty. Count 11, guilty. Count 12, guilty. Count 13, guilty. Count 14 and 15, guilty. Count 16, guilty. Remember, this is a unanimous decision by the jury on each of these counts. Count 17, guilty. Count 18, guilty. Count 19, guilty. Count 20, guilty. Count 21, guilty. Count 22, guilty. Count 23, guilty. Count 24, guilty. Count 25, guilty. Count 26, guilty. Count 27, guilty. Count 28, guilty. 29, guilty. Count 30, guilty. Count 31, guilty. Count 32, guilty. Count 33, guilty. Count 34 guilty. Donald Trump has been found guilty on all counts of falsifying business records in an attempt to cover up these alleged relationships in the New York hush money trial. It's an extraordinary moment.
Nora, to hear you read what you just read is a moment of enormous gravity for this country. We cannot overlook that. To hear that word, guilty, not just once, but 34 times about a former president of the United States in any context is completely uncharted territory. And there will be a raging debate across this country about the propriety of bringing these charges. But under our system, a grand jury heard the evidence. A grand jury rendered an indictment. And through all due process, the former president was accorded all due process rights. And a jury of his peers assembled in New York in this courthouse found him guilty on all charges. This is not just a legal moment for this country. It is not just a political moment for this country. It is a moment where everything about politics and law and our orientation to both are convulsed as never before.
Donald Trump has become the first former president ever convicted of a crime. I want to bring in Robert Costa, who has covered Donald Trump for a long time and written books about Donald Trump. I can only imagine what the former president is doing right now.
Nora, this is the conclusion of a trial, but it's only the beginning of a fight. I've already gotten new reporting from Trump sources. They are planning to appeal this decision as much as they can, and they plan to mount a grievance war across the country. To echo what Majors said, this is a moment of seriousness for the country on a legal, political, and democratic front, because you now have a presumptive Republican nominee who will be mounting an appeals process as he heads toward the Republican convention, and he has the Republican Party behind him. It was here in the park, steps away, that the Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, Mike Johnson, came here to say, we stand with Trump. So many have come here wearing red ties and saying that Trump is our candidate, regardless of whether he's convicted of a crime in New York City. Here in deep blue Manhattan right now, there were cheers that went up in the park around us as the conviction was made clear to the crowd that has been gathering here. But from Trump supporters across the country, there is anger and frustration right now. And Trump campaign officials are arguing this is going to make Trump stronger inside the party. But now, as a convicted felon, it could raise new questions about maybe not his nomination for the Republican Party, but Democratic sources really believe some swing voters in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, in the suburbs across the country might start to say, do we really want to have a convicted felon in the White House? It's a tag that Trump can no longer escape.
It's an important, we're talking about a legal issue right now, but a political issue as well, as you point out. I want to go straight to Errol Barnett, who is right outside, who can give us a sense of what's happening there outside the courtroom. Errol?
Nora, two angles I can give you. Outside the courthouse, we're hearing some sense of cheering and people yelling guilty. The courthouse directly behind me, while our reporters inside are painting some of the color as the foreperson read out the verdict. It was very similar, Nora, to the way you read this out. It was quiet and somber inside the courtroom, with former President Donald Trump seated as the defendant, looking at the jury as the foreperson, leaning with his left arm on a railing and a right hand holding the microphone, slowly 34 times said guilty as the judge was asking for the jury's verdict on these felony counts. Then the judge asks the jury, is this accurate? Is this the proper reflection of your verdict? They said yes. And during this entire time, Donald Trump staring intently at each of the jurors, the lawyers standing with their hands clasped, and the jurors at this moment being thanked by the judge for their service. Judge Merchant acknowledging that these past 6 weeks have been stressful for them. Let's not forget, some jurors that were selected early dropped out and buckled under the pressure, the media spotlight, and the importance of the moment. But inside the courthouse, a somber moment as Donald Trump, former president of the United States, GOP presumptive nominee, had to sit and listen as a defendant as a jury of 12 of his peers found him guilty on all 34 felony counts. This was the moment that Donald Trump became a felon.
Errol Barnett, thank you so much. Want to bring in our legal panel. Again, former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney and CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe joins me again. And Rebecca, let's talk about this. Donald Trump is 78 years old, a first-time offender in the eyes of the New York court system. Will he go to jail? What do you think happens?
We really won't know until the sentencing. I think that, he's certainly not going to jail for the rest of his life on these counts, but there is a real possibility of some jail time. And of course, any jail time for somebody in his position of his age is a significant thing right now. One other thing that has struck me about this case is there has been so much criticism of the case. And in a way, this verdict does vindicate Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, who brought this and defended it as a case that is quite standard for New York and for Manhattan. And, of course, when all eyes are on our local justice system, sometimes things look unusual, bizarre, different. But in many ways, this is not as different from other cases as some people suggested it was. And the evidence, as we can tell from this quick, strong verdict, was fairly strong.
Rebecca, thank you. I want to bring in Caroline Pelosi. She's a criminal defense attorney and lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. And on that same point, Caroline, because I think people want to know not only what happens to Donald Trump, what happens in this presidential election, which is now 6 months from now. The question before the judge in terms of sentencing, prison time, or there could be probation, right? What are some of the things that the judge will consider?
Absolutely. It is within the judge's discretion. There is no mandatory minimum jail sentence for these crimes. I totally agree with Rebecca. This is a huge win for Alvin Bragg. This case had a long and winding road to get here. Remember, it was called the zombie theory. It just wouldn't die. It spanned over two different district attorneys. People resigned in protest for the ways that they felt about whether or not the case was being brought. But this will mark the beginning of a lengthy appellate process. I like to point to the Harvey Weinstein verdict being overturned. That took soup to nuts 4 years. Justice takes time. So there are many legal issues here that I think are ripe for review. I don't know that any will take the day, but certainly there are meritorious arguments to be made. But when you're thinking about potentially putting a presidential candidate in jail, there are some considerations to be had. But I would note he was not, a stellar defendant during this case. Those are aggravating factors. These issues with the gag order, his behavior throughout the trial, that could potentially be a factor in Judge Merchan's analysis of whether or not to impose jail time here. Also, things like remorse. It does not seem as though the former president is at all remorseful for any of these actions. We'll have to wait and see for the arguments that are made in the sentencing memoranda.
It's a good point, Caroline. As you note, Judge Merchan has found Donald Trump that violated his gag order 10 times during this trial. Caroline Pelosi, stand by. I want to bring in former Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance, who first opened this investigation into former President Donald Trump in 2018, but left office before the charges were filed. Cy, good to see you. What's your reaction to today's verdict?
My reaction is a huge congratulations to the assistant DAs and to Alvin Bragg for the amazing job that they've done in trying what was a very difficult case, a complicated case. And I think from an outside perspective, because I wasn't in the courtroom, I think they tried it almost flawlessly. So it was an important case. And I congratulate them in the office. As you said, this case began. The Trump investigation began some time ago when I was district attorney. We had to go to the Supreme Court twice in order to get access to his financial tax records. That led to, when I was in office, his indictment for the Trump's company's indictment for tax crimes. And then as the case moved on, DA Bragg took it up and has succeeded in doing something very important.
We are watching now, just outside the courtroom, members of Trump's team coming out, some of his lawyers, as well as his communication specialists. So my guess is they're trying to decide what to do next and whether we'll hear from Donald Trump himself. So I do want to ask you, though, given this verdict, do you see there are grounds for appeal? What could the timeline be?
Well, I think the appeals will happen whether there are grounds for them or not. I think there will be many claims by the Trump team for judicial errors, bias, errors in instruction. I think the appeals will come from all sides, but I think that by no means are those appeals certain to prevail. And at the moment, I think what we're seeing is a sad day in the sense that a former president has been convicted. A day we should celebrate, however, for the victory of the justice system and our jury system and our court system to be able to manage a case this significant and difficult. And I think it will ultimately, I hope, end up having a calming influence. But as I say that, I think really what we'll see next is what is the political reaction and how the political reaction will be managed over the next months.
And Cy, I want to just listen in here now because Donald Trump is approaching the cameras.
Are you worried about going to jail? This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. We have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble, but this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
And there you have it. Donald Trump calling this a rigged trial. We're hearing from sources close to him they do plan to appeal. The sentencing, we have learned, is going to be on July 11th at 10 a.m., where the judge has discretion. Each of these counts, my understanding, can carry as much as 4 years of jail time, as well as thousands of dollars in fine. Just want to quickly fact check something that the former president said. Scott McFarlane is with us. Donald Trump has repeated that this was launched by the Biden administration, but we should just clarify that so that people don't think this is something that Joe Biden initiated.
This is a grand jury. And this is a jury of his peers who did the work in this prosecution adjudication. But it's not just Donald Trump, Nora. It's his allies. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, has just released a statement saying Democrats cheered as they convicted the leader of the opposing party. Elise Stefanik, who chairs the House Republican Conference, said this is a Biden administration prosecution. Not only is this not federal, this is a local prosecution, but this is not a Democratic Party process. But that date really jumps out at me, Nora. July 11th for sentencing. That's 4 days before the Republican National Convention.
Wow.
Opens in Milwaukee, swing state. And to Scott's point, and we should not overlook this, Nora, the politics of this will rage from this moment forward. And those who support former President Trump will regard this as a New York matter and a Democratic matter, not an American matter. They will be offended by this, and they will, to the former president's point, try to rally their supporters and other like-minded Republicans and others on November 5th. The former president has a very serious legal problem. He is trying to remedy it through politics.
I want to bring in Robert Costa, who is there outside the courthouse. And Robert, you could hear how angry Donald Trump was in those comments. What are you learning?
Nora, just seconds ago, got off the phone with someone very close to former President Trump, said he was expressing his anger, his fury about this verdict. Even before it was read, he was predicting to associates that he believed that this trial was a disaster and that he was going to fight it all the way through appeal. He was already signaling to some of the top Republicans in the country in the past hour that regardless of what happened, he wanted them to be with him. He believed they would stand with him. And he is really preparing his allies, tell me just now, to fight this all the way and to use this as a political weapon against President Biden. The Justice Department not involved in this case. This is a case in Lower Manhattan. This was a jury comprised of 12 New Yorkers, people who are his peers in his home city of New York. At the same time, you're going to hear former President Trump constantly use this as a refrain that he was targeted by this trial, targeted by this prosecutor, and he is going to use his own channels of communication, whether it's social media, some kind of rally or speeches or other means, to get his message out there without fact-checking and often without the bounds of normal discourse holding him in. But this is American politics today. He has helped to create and really spearheaded this environment we are in now. But I know from people who have been with him in the past hour that he is furious and that this is not just something he's going to leave to the lawyers. He wants to be out front now, and this country is going to see him out front all summer.
Want to bring back in former Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance and give you the opportunity, sir, to respond to those charges that this case was a disgrace and that it was rigged and brought by the Biden administration.
Well, certainly the origins of this case, which was when I was district attorney, had nothing to do with the Biden administration. And I don't think anything changed with regard to DA Bragg taking over and developing his separate case out of where the case began with us. I think what you're going to your panelists have got it completely right. This is now going to go into the streets. It's going to be a matter of politics. I think the president will take this to the Supreme Court, where I think he hopes that it will finally receive the kind of audience he wishes he had in a jury, and that's going to be taking some time. But it's a great day for the DA's office in Manhattan. I'm proud of their work. I'm proud to be associated with the office. And I think this is a controversial case, but tough cases are controversial. And they did a fabulous job under a lot of pressure and under very bright lights in the public.
And Cy, explain that. How does a state case make its way up to the Supreme Court? Well,
the Supreme Court has issued rulings in many state cases. It will go through the state appeals process, and then after the Court of Appeals, assuming the courts of appeal in New York do not overturn the verdict, and former President Trump will take his best shot at each level and take his best hard shots, then they will appeal to the Supreme Court to accept certiorari, which is a fancy word meaning the Supreme Court agrees to hear the case, and that's the straight path, either through the state system or the federal system, where a defendant has the opportunity to at least ask the highest court in the land to consider reviewing the case.
Cy Vance, thank you. I want to bring in Jan Crawford, who covers the Supreme Court for us. Explain that process, but also, I mean, we're talking again, right? As Cy Vance noted, this will go to the streets, but there's still more to do in the courts, and we're still awaiting decisions from the Supreme Court as well on other matters.
Well, sure. The Supreme Court right now has 2 other cases involving former President Trump, but they're both related to the prosecution of Trump for his efforts, allegedly his efforts, to overturn the 2020 election here in Washington on January 6th, largely, and whether he's absolutely immune from prosecution for those actions. That's what the court's deciding now, and whether that case can even go forward. forward? And if it can he be charged and other January 6 defendants be charged with obstruction? Major legal issues for the former president and, of course, the court to decide between now and the end of June. But right now, those are going to take a back seat because what many people had hoped to see, certainly Democrats had hoped to see, was a conviction of former President Trump, and they got that. So I think whether or not there was going to be a trial or not on the January 6 efforts.
All right. And I understand we've got some new information coming in from Ed O'Keefe, who is at the White House for us. Ed, what are you learning? Are we going to hear from President Biden?
We are not going to hear from President Biden, but we have a written statement from him, Nora. I'll explain why we won't in a moment. In his statement, he says, in New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There's still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. The threat Trump poses to our democracy has never been greater, the president says in his statement from his campaign. He says Trump, quote, is running an increasingly unhinged campaign of revenge and retribution, pledging to be a dictator on day one and calling for our Constitution to be terminated so he can regain and keep power. A second Trump term means chaos, ripping away Americans' freedoms and fomenting political violence, and the American people will reject it this November. The president is at his vacation home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware today, marking the 9th anniversary of the death of his son, Beau. We saw him briefly this morning in Wilmington, Delaware, at a church service with his family, and they stopped by a veterans memorial before he headed to that beach home. He's expected back here tomorrow for a few events for a few hours. His campaign and here at the White House, they have stressed that the president was likely to say something in some form, but not necessarily make a big deal of this. And isn't it telling that both the convicted former president and the sitting president have said the same thing, that ultimately the American people get to make this decision in November? Nora?
Ed O'Keefe at the White House, thank you. Want to go back outside the courthouse now to Robert Costa and Graham Cates, who have been covering this case so closely. Graham, I know you were inside, just made your way out. Give us a sense of what was happening, the mood there, and the demeanor of the individuals.
As the jurors walked in, neither Trump nor the jurors looked at each other, which is different than earlier in the day. Trump had usually stared and kind of studied the jurors. And then as the foreperson read for each count, guilty, 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 Trump stared straight ahead. He appeared emotionless. When he was finally excused from the proceeding, as he just began walking out, he kind of grabbed his son Eric's hand really briefly, and then with as deep of a frown as you've ever seen on Trump's face, walked slowly out of the room with his entourage behind him.
And
his family was there throughout so much of this. No, but Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr. was here, but Eric Trump was also here for the civil fraud trial. For Trump, he ran a family company, all of these payments made through the Trump organization, his family there with him in the courtroom.
Yeah, Eric, more than anyone, throughout this trial and his civil fraud trial, came frequently on many days.
And Robert, I want to ask you, because we have now learned that this sentencing by Judge Merchan will be July 11th, and Donald Trump will be sentenced as a convicted felon 4 days before the Republican convention. Can you run a presidential race just on grievance alone? I mean, how will that change the dynamics, the contours of this race?
It's not going to change the contours of this race too much. I've spent a lot of time talking to officials in the Biden campaign and talking to Trump campaign officials, and they've made it clear to me on the Trump side that grievance is the fuel that helps Trump supporters really get aligned with him, even if they have concerns about his conduct or different policy positions. But Trump's also running a campaign concurrently against President Biden's record on the economy, about border security, railing against the president's policy on immigration. So in many respects, respects, he's running a traditional Republican campaign, and that's why he has the Republican Party ensconced in his grip. He is someone who has the speaker, so many senators saying, "We're with you, Trump," nodding along. They almost forgive his grievance because they believe he's able to put together a coalition of populism, nationalism, and anger that will propel not only him to the White House, but them. And that's really the calculus here for so many Republicans at the highest level I'm speaking with. They're staying with Trump because they believe he still is, even as a convicted felon who might have a prison sentence as he approaches the Republican convention, he still is their path to power.
I think this is a good time to go through some of the basic questions that are out there, because Donald Trump said that the real verdict will be on November 5th. That is now 159 days away. Major, he can run for president as a convicted felon.
Absolutely.
Right. Can he vote?
Yes, because he's not, so he's not adjudicated fully because the appellate process goes on, so it's not over until it's over. And as Cy Vance indicated, that overness may take a considerable period of time because the former president will try to find every venue possible legal to reevaluate and possibly overturn this verdict.
And in reading
so until all that is done, he is a voter in good standing, to my understanding.
There are former prosecutors who said that it's unlikely that a 77-year-old former president, since this is his first offense in this court, would be sentenced to jail. But it could happen. But could he be elected president while serving prison time?
Well, obviously that's never happened, right? But there's nothing that we know of that would stop that from happening. And even if he doesn't go to jail, there's a number of other options available to this judge, including house arrest. So what does that mean for the campaign? It is almost inconceivable to kind of think about all, the road ahead for us now as this political campaign starts with a convicted felon as potentially the Republican nominee.
And our polling division and election analysts, Anthony Salvanto, Kabir, others, know how difficult it has been, impossible, Nora, to actually gauge what people's reaction is going to be if there was a conviction. We now are in the first hours of the country absorbing this. And all these questions now overhang a presidential campaign in ways they didn't 1 hour ago. And when people think about this, some will be enraged, some will find solace that there is accountability institutionally in our country and our system works, our justice system works, and others are going to ponder, well, my goodness, what does this mean if he is elected? And those imponderables now are realities. And how people process that and then decide their voting behavior from that is unknown territory, but it begins in earnest this afternoon.
But, he set the ground yesterday for this, saying that Mother Teresa wouldn't have even beaten these charges and the system was rigged. And people will believe that.
Some people will believe that, for sure.
There are a significant number of people will believe that. You look at polling that shows a complete erosion of faith in our institutions across the board. Many people say that Donald Trump caused some of that. But when you hear Republican leaders right now in the House and Senate issuing statements saying this is a travesty, this is a pro-Biden judge, this was rigged from the beginning, a significant number of American people will believe that.
You don't think it's a stretch to compare Donald Trump to Mother Teresa?
Well, I didn't say that. I think he said that.
Yeah.
And there's going to be this process to try to discredit jurors. We've seen that in the previous prosecutions that are aligned to January 6th and the 2020 election, where they say it's a liberal jury in Washington, D.C., a liberal jury in Manhattan, almost like there's
it is a liberal jury in Manhattan. I think that's hard to argue with.
But for the moment the jurors met behind closed doors, you function as a jury. And the foreman had to get up, hold a microphone today, and announce a verdict against a former U.S. president. And there is always this concern. Anybody related with a nexus to a Trump case has the threat of being threatened, doxxed, or hassled.
But, Jan, those jurors also swore that they could be impartial.
Oh, absolutely.
So just to say that they're from a liberal area that votes liberally and votes Democratic does not mean that they did not promise under oath that they would be impartial.
And I certainly am not implying that. I am saying that we have to acknowledge what the facts are, because those are facts that the American people are going to hear.
To Jan's point, inferences will be drawn.
Yeah.
Inferences in the political dialogue across this country will be drawn about the composition of this jury and the location of this case.
And the
inferences will be drawn.
And the judge, and why the case wasn't brought initially under the previous district attorney, and why the federal government didn't pursue these federal election charges against Trump. I mean, there's a number of questions that people are going to have. There's a number of questions that Trump is going to raise on appeal, starting from the very beginning with the indictment itself and how some of, what was some of those underlying object offenses. There are constitutional issues that he can raise. There is a lot there that he can use as this campaign unfolds to argue and point to that this entire prosecution was flawed from the get-go.
I think we all have a lot of questions, too, about what happens next, not only in the political arena, but also what happens to Donald Trump. So I do want to bring back in Caroline Polisi. She, Caroline, the judge, as we've noted, has wide discretion over the sentence here. But do you think that Judge Merchan will sentence the former president to prison?
I don't. I personally do not think that, look, for better or for worse, Trump has been treated like any other criminal defendant. The fact is, based on a reading of a lot of these types of cases, not many are actually sent to serve time. And so if you're treating the former president just like any other regular Manhattanite that would have been sentenced here, as a first-time nonviolent offender, it would be very unlikely that he would go to prison. I think that if he does get sentenced, that would just sort of add fuel to his fire in terms of acting as though he's being singled out here. So not to mention the fact that there would be issues with the Secret Service. He would not be with the general population. It would be a big burden on the prison system to have him there. So personally, I think that the objectives of sentencing can be accomplished through other forms of punishment, fines, probation, that type of thing. So I don't see it happening personally.
What do you think is the more likely sentence?
I think he will get a probationary sentence. I think that there will be fines to be, tied to the offense conduct in this case. Look, the fact is it's not going to have any effect on his run for presidency from a legal perspective. Obviously, there's nothing in the Constitution that, says that he cannot run. On the voting part, he's registered to vote in Florida, and they do sort of concede to the state in which the potential felony has been adjudicated. And in New York State, any felon can vote as long as they're not currently incarcerated serving time. So if he doesn't serve any time, he will definitely be able to vote.
In researching and preparing for today, I did read, though, that if Donald Trump is sentenced to probation, he would be required to clear any out-of-state travel, such as campaign rallies or fundraisers, with a probation officer.
Well, that is absolutely true.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that can be done through staff and lawyers, but nevertheless, something we haven't seen before.
Absolutely. And that happens every day. I do that for my clients a lot, all the time. It is not fun dealing with probation, getting every little, detail of your life, really having them sign off on any time you want to travel. I do not see the former president, conceding lightly to this type of probationary sentence, but nonetheless, he will have to.
And then finally, Caroline, on grounds for appeal, what do you think Trump's attorneys could latch onto?
There are a lot of grounds for appeal here, starting with just the law, the statute under which the DA brought this case. There's been a lot said about this issue of unanimity among jurors. While the elements of the offense here were reached unanimously, there is this added little hook here that the object offense here, the New York State election law conspiracy, had to be done through quote unquote unlawful means. The jurors did not have to find unanimously with respect to what those unlawful means were. Remember, there were 3 presented to them: tax fraud, FICA violations, and other falsification of business records. I think there are potential due process issues in that statute. And then with respect to the jury instructions, they weren't allowed to bring them back with them. There will be questions on just how they arrived at their verdict. There is a lot here. I'm not convinced that any will take the day, but I do think that they are not frivolous arguments.
Carolyn, thank you. I just want to share with you what we're hearing from our Pat Milton, a producer out there, is that as soon as the verdict was released, the NYPD dramatically increased their presence there. You may have been able to hear as Robert Costa was speaking, or Errol Barnett, the NYPD helicopters flying overhead of the courthouse. Streets all locked down there. I think you still see the president's motorcade there. That's the shot there. There's some 100 mixed onlookers, protesters, supporters. There are Trump supporters there wearing red MAGA hats. They are gathered. So it is quite the scene in Manhattan there for this historic verdict. Just to remind everyone, just a short time ago, learning that this jury of 12 were unanimous in convicting Donald Trump on all 34 counts. And Donald Trump will be sentenced now on July 11th. That date significant, certainly, as he will become a convicted felon just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. And Major, I'm wondering what happens now in the next couple of weeks. Donald Trump can now campaign freely, which he has had trouble doing because he has had to appear in court every day. Right. So he can travel the country. We don't know what will happen on July 11th, but if he sends to probation, he could still be out there on the campaign trail.
He could still be out on the campaign trail, providing it's approved through all the probationary processes, which is also uncharted terrain. And in the one sense that I think this trial matters politically is that for the former president, every day at the courthouse was a day to prepare for this day. He knew that charges rendered against him could result in a guilty verdict. So how do you prepare for that? You don't prepare for it psychologically, not if you're former President Trump. You prepare for it politically. And seeding the clouds every single day with deep-seated questions about the process and the orientation of the judge, the jury, the proceedings around it, some of it completely without factual basis, some of it driven entirely by grievance, some of it completely ignoring the underlying facts, but some of it based on his own gut sense that if he were convicted, what he had to do in that intervening time, however long this trial took, was prepare his supporters for the idea that if it was a guilty verdict, it would be on its moment deemed fraudulent and offensive to them. That's the political terrain that the former president has occupied every single day of this trial. And it now takes on greater significance because, in his rhetoric, what I foretold has now happened, and I will campaign on that basis.
I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, who is at the White House and has traveled recently with President Biden out on the campaign trail. What are you hearing from Biden's advisors?
Nora, we've just gotten off the phone with White House and campaign officials who tell us we will not see or hear from the president for the remainder of today. He remains at his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, with his family privately marking the death of his son, Beau. Campaign aides stress that the reaction to this, whatever it looks like in the coming days, is expected to be modest because it is their view, based on polling done by us, by other news organizations, by the campaign, that this is not going to move large blocks of voters in battleground states in any real measurable way, that opinions on the former president are pretty much baked in. And to that point, we saw just minutes after this verdict, the former president send an appeal to his supporters to donate to his campaign, calling him a, quote, political prisoner. We saw the current president use his Twitter or X account to blast out a fundraising appeal to his supporters, saying this will all be determined in November. And so both of these campaigns now are preparing for just that. In the case of the Biden campaign, he was in Philadelphia yesterday speaking about the economy, trying to sustain support with black voters, and aides that I was just speaking with remind us the plan is to keep focused on issues like access to abortion rights, corporate greed. You're going into the month of June, so you're dealing with a lot of anniversaries around mass shootings, and that's expected to be part of his focus. And on the world stage, he'll be in France and Italy in the next 2 weeks, meeting with European leaders. There's news this afternoon from here regarding the expansion of the military operations in Ukraine. Just be presidential and allow that contrast to stand alongside what we're seeing on the streets of New York and continue to play out. We now are being handed a statement from the White House counsel's office, and this will stand, Nora, as the only official comment from the White House today. Spokesman for the White House counsel's office saying, quote, "We respect the rule of law and have no additional comment." Nora?
Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much. I want to bring back in Cy Vance as we watch the president's motorcade leave the courthouse there. And Cy, thank you again for staying with us. And it's great to have your expertise as the former Manhattan district attorney. So Trump would likely have to visit this probation office. Is that now? What is that like?
Well, he, like every other defendant, is going to be interviewed by the probation department because the probation department makes a recommendation to the judge regarding sentence as a state organizational matter. I don't know whether that he was checking that box out while he was still in court. More likely, he was staying there because of the security issues that they wanted to have locked down between courthouse and his Trump residence.
Yeah, and Cy, Major Garrett has a question for you.
Cy, so good to have you with us.
Yeah,
could you, from your perspective, answer or inform parts of the country that hear former President Trump say this case never should have been brought? There is no crime. It is so novel as to stretch all understood bounds of prosecution, even in Manhattan. Those are, I think, the core accusations meant to undermine what we're seeing playing out today. Can you address those?
Well, first of all, you've got to go through a process before you charge anyone, let alone the president, of presenting a case to a grand jury. Those grand jury minutes are reviewed by a judge. The judge goes through innumerable layers of motions to dismiss. I reject the claim that Judge Merchan is biased. Obviously, the former president would disagree with that, but I think he is a very middle-of-the-road, smart, disciplined jurist, and I think he deserves huge credit for managing a very, very difficult case and a very, very difficult client. So it's easy to blame New York. It's easy to blame the Manhattan DA's office. We were the first office to indict his alter ego company and pursue investigations extend, but that's because it's because of what he did, not because of politics.
Cy, let me ask you, you know Judge Merchan, certainly within the legal system. Do you think he will sentence Donald Trump to prison?
I doubt it. I doubt it. And but giving what Judge Merchan wide room to not, not telling him anything about what to do. I think that if this were an more ordinary case, given that Alan Weisselberg was sent to 3 months in prison and then another 3 months for lying, that his boss, Donald Trump, in any other world would probably be getting an equivalent sentence. A sentence of jail is not required for an E felony, which is what he's been convicted of now. And your other panelists have said there are lots of options, from home arrest to checking in with the probation before leaving the state. There are lots of ways that they can try to control the president's behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I heard what you said, Cy, that you doubt that Judge Merchan would sentence Donald Trump to prison time. But if he did sentence him to prison time, do you think he would grant bond on his appeal while he makes the appeal?
I honestly don't see a world in which Donald Trump is sentenced to jail.
Yeah, I think that's an important clarification. Yeah, an important, and I appreciate that, Cy Vance. I want to just bring in Katrina Kaufman. She is also there outside the courthouse. And Katrina, I know you were inside. You saw Donald Trump up close. Share with us your reporting.
I was sitting right there as Donald Trump exited the courtroom after this verdict, a very deep frown on his face, followed by his attorney, Todd Blanche, who looked equally upset, and his son, Eric. And as the jury had come into the room before to deliver the verdict, Trump was looking towards them, and none of them looked him in the eye as they walked by. And also, when each one was confirming that they agreed with this verdict that the foreman had read, he looked over at each juror one by one as they affirmed the verdict. His son Eric was sitting behind him that whole time, and when they got up, he and Eric had a little bit of a handshake before they exited the room. But I can't describe to you the feeling of tension as well as we waited for the verdict to come down. We got about a 20-minute warning from when the jury sent a note to the judge, and we found out. We were all just sitting there, and you really could have just cut through that tension with a knife. But clearly this was a very difficult moment for him. I was watching him as well as the verdict came down, and he just had this very blank look on his face. His eyes were so squinted that it was almost hard to tell if they were even open during part of the time that the foreman was reading that he was guilty on each of these 34 charges.
Katrina, thank you. And just to recap what we have learned in the last hour, this historic decision, Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts. This is the first time in history that this has happened with a former president. He is also the Republican nominee for president and will be sentenced 4 days before the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee this July, and just after a presidential debate as well, the first this summer against Joe Biden, which will be must-see TV, no less. I want to ask about that because I think many people look at sometimes, I just want to step back for a second. When we show national polls or you read about national polls about the mood of the country, those are the mood of the national electorate. But a presidential race is decided in battleground states. Sure. And it will be decided in 7 key battleground states, just like it was in the last election. And of those 7 battleground states, that's what we'll be looking at closely too, is does this sway that small percentage or two of voters either way? Does it bring some of Trump's supporters who've been on the fence and say, you know what, this was rigged. I'm really angry. I want to change the country. And they decide to come back. Or do some of those independents in these key 7 battleground states say, you know what, I kind of liked Trump. I like some of the things he did on the economy or on immigration, but this just can't go on. I will cast my vote for Joe Biden, or I'll stay home. I mean, that's the question that confronts us now in terms of the political arena, correct?
Exactly. And there's polling data in, let's just say, 3 of those battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that show anywhere from 10 to 15% believe if there's a guilty verdict, it might influence how they approach their vote. Well, that's not a sizable total in the 100% context, but in states like Wisconsin, decided by 20,000, Michigan decided by 180,000, Pennsylvania decided in 2020 by 80,000. Suddenly that number, that percentage of people whose votes actually they thought beforehand could be influenced and possibly negatively about Trump if he's found guilty, well, suddenly that becomes very, very important for the former president and for President Biden. But I would say this about that polling data. It's instructive, Nora, but it is not reliable, because until this moment happens, until this history lands before all of us, we don't know what our attitude is going to be. Now we're beginning that process.
I'm interested what happens to the polls after this remarkable 3 or 4 weeks we're about to experience in America, where there's a presidential debate between 2 men who've had the job before, a president of the United States now out of office being sentenced for a felony, and then a Republican National Convention. And somewhere in between, we also could find out what the Supreme Court is going to let happen here in Washington on the 2020 election conspiracy case.
And whether that trial will go forward.
Whether it even goes forward. All of that happening in this finite period of time.
And Jan, you cover the court so closely. What do you think happens with the Supreme Court? That they will say that he's not completely immune from prosecution?
I mean, because Donald Trump is saying he's absolutely immune from prosecution in the January 6th stuff. They're not going to go along with that. But the appeals court kind of said, well, no, Donald Trump, you can be prosecuted for pretty much anything. I think they're going to find some middle ground where there's some immunity. What is it? And what does that mean? That means that we're going to get a decision potentially at the end of June. Is the court going to send it back to a lower court? And then is that going to further delay this trial?
But practically speaking, what does that mean? So if there is some limited immunity, that would be things that he did while he was president of the United States. So would that cover then these classified documents or January 6th? Those trials could then go forward?
Yes, potentially, absolutely. I do not see the Supreme Court in this case shutting off those federal trials. They may limit some of the charges, but they're not going to say Donald Trump cannot be prosecuted in federal court. But
that will again convulse the nation, don't you think?
No, I don't. I think, yes, it'll be a big headline and it's going to be a big story, but this is the earthquake. This is the trial. This is the conviction that Donald Trump's opponents wanted and they got. There's going to be tremendous validation. Many people believe the system worked as it intended. I think the big headline that we just heard a few moments ago, though, was from Alvin Bragg's predecessor. When you asked him, is Donald Trump going to jail? I mean, he's facing multiple years in prison as a result of this conviction. And he said he can't see a scenario that he would go to jail for this. So now we have a situation where he's been convicted of falsifying business records with intent to cover up a crime that voters really wouldn't have cared about in 2016. And are people actually going to care? And is that going to affect those polls?
Well, it's an excellent question. And fortunately, we have Nicole Killian, who is out on the campaign trail. She's in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. She's been talking to voters. And Nicole, I'm dying to know what you've been learning as you have been out there speaking with people.
Yeah, well, Nora, unsurprisingly, some of the reaction has largely fallen on party lines. As you mentioned, this is a critical battleground state, but this area of Allentown in the Lehigh Valley is really a bellwether for the state of Pennsylvania. So we did talk to some Democratic voters, some Republican voters. Of course, many Democrats tell us that they believe the former president should have been convicted, but many Republican voters that we talked to feel that the system is broken, that this was just a political trial and a political decision. That being said, one Republican voter I spoke to in particular is still wavering to a certain extent in terms of his vote. This is somebody who supported the former president back in 2016 and 2020, but is not sure whether he will support the former president going forward. Nora?
That is really interesting, Nicole. Thank you so much for your reporting there. It has been a historic day here in America. The first ever criminal trial of a president ends in conviction. Former President Donald J. Trump convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree related to those hush money payments. Each of the 34 felony counts is punishable by up to 4 years in prison. But it is up to the judge to sentence Trump to jail, prison, home confinement, probation, or a fine. And we will learn the former president's sentence on July 11th. That is just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. The former president is a convicted felon, but that does not prevent him from running for office for another term in the White House. And it is important also to note that he can't pardon himself if he does become president again, because this is a state crime. Once again, the breaking news: former President Donald Trump has been found guilty by a jury of 12, unanimous, on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7 local news, and tonight we'll have a full wrap-up on the CBS Evening News. Thank you to everyone that joined us. This has been a CBS News special report.
This is breaking news.
And now breaking news at 6 tonight. Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee for president, is now a convicted felon. Good evening. I'm Christine Johnson.
And I'm Maurice Dubois. The nation trying to get its collective head around what we just saw. A jury announcing the verdict late this afternoon, or just about 4:30. We learned just after 5 the jury had found him guilty on all 34 counts in the hush money case in Lower Manhattan. The sentencing is set for July 11th at 10 a.m.
Let's go live now to CBS 2's Dick Brennan. He is downtown at Manhattan Criminal Court, and he begins our team coverage here on this historic day in New York. Dick.
Christine, Maurice, I got to tell you, the moment of the verdict being read was extraordinary around here, because it was sort of being piped out into the park. People were hearing it as it was happening, and then you heard this uproar from anti-Trump demonstrators cheering, and then there was some fighting back and forth, and then behind me, a ring of security from police, helicopters moved in. That was the scene on the outside. The scene on the inside, very different. Former President Trump spoke out almost immediately. Let's listen to what he had to say.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
November 5th, Election Day. Joining me now, Alice Gaynor. You were in the court for that dramatic reading of the verdict. What was it like?
So it was dramatic, really, because around 4:15, the judge came into the courtroom. We hadn't received a note from the jury all day, really, so we thought they were going to be dismissed. The judge said as much. He said, I'm going to give them a few more minutes, and then I'm going to dismiss them, release them for the day at 4:30. Well, all of a sudden, he came back in after 4:30, and the jury had a note. Now, normally when there's a note, the buzzer goes off, it rings in the courtroom. We didn't even hear that. So that's why it was so shocking, because the judge said, we've received a note, the jury has reached a verdict, and they would like 30 more minutes to fill out the forms if that's okay. So there was this audible gasp in the courtroom because nobody was expecting it. They thought they were going to be dismissed for the day and that we'd be back tomorrow. So behind me it was a row of the public, and I heard court officers telling them, no outbursts in court, one way or the other, keep it quiet. So when the jury was brought in, the foreperson read the verdict, all 34 counts, guilty. They cut the video feed to the defense table, so we could not see the former president's reaction, because normally we can see the monitor with our binoculars. Even though we're in the main courtroom, we don't have a view of his face because
he's
we're
in front of you.
behind
Yeah,
him.
right. Yeah.
Exactly. So they cut the feed. We couldn't see his face in that moment. The jury, from what I could see, no expression. And all you could hear in the courtroom at that point was really loud typing. All of the journalists in there, who were nervous, by the way, because the Wi-Fi has been so spotty all day.
They don't want to get it wrong, right?
Exactly. So thankfully it worked out. We were able to update the public. When the former president walked out, he was very red-faced. He sort of awkwardly went to reach for Eric Trump, his son's hand. I don't know if he shook it or what he was trying to do, a father-son moment. And when he was walking out, he was a little bit sweaty, had a very angry expression on his face. He walked outside. We just heard him speak a few moments ago. You had that soundbite. And he said a lot of the things he's been saying this entire trial, that it was rigged. We do know sentencing will be July 11th and 10 a.m.
4 days before the Republican National Convention, which is extraordinary.
That's right. And the defense, they're the ones who were pushing for a mid-July sentencing date. They spoke up first. And there was a moment the judge said, what's the bail status? And prosecutors said, there is no bail.
There is no bail.
So the former president walked out, he left, and we were immediately released from the courtroom, which, as you know, typically we're frozen in place when he's on the move. But today, they let us out actually fairly quickly.
Now, you've been there for 6 weeks, and you've seen this develop and really end. And a lot of people said, hey, 2 days of deliberations, maybe 10, 12 hours, that was rather quickly for a very complex case. How did you view it when it all unfolded?
Well, again, it was surprising because we thought they were going home, but I actually thought there would be a verdict today. You can never, ever predict what a jury is going to do. But this has been a long trial, and they deliberated yesterday all day. They had a few notes that they sent. They got readback of testimony from Michael Cohen, from David Pecker, namely about that 2015 Trump Tower meeting. That is the meeting between Trump, Cohen, and Pecker, where Pecker volunteered to be the eyes and ears of the Trump campaign. So they reheard that testimony, and they also requested a portion of readback from the judge's instructions. That jury instruction sheet is 55 pages.
Right. Well, that's another reason why we're all sitting there. This is going to take a lot of time, right? And yet it came very quickly. And I also have to ask you, when you just mentioned, did you ever see a turning point within the trial? I mean, you looked at those jurors every day. Were they getting bored? Did they seem engaged all the time? They had a former president sitting in front of them. That is, they felt probably that they had a high bar if they were going to bring back a guilty verdict, correct?
I mean, they were focused this entire trial. You really have to give them credit, and as they should be. And yesterday, I noted in my live report, the judge was thanking the alternate jurors who were not yet dismissed yesterday. They had to stick around. He was saying, I know you're paying attention. I've seen you taking notes. One of you went through 3 notebooks. So they have been paying attention. And I mean, granted, it's a trial, and prosecutors called 20 witnesses. Some of them were people who work for Verizon, for AT&T, and they're custodial witnesses. They're just testifying about phone records. And that can get a little boring in court, but to their credit, again, they were paying attention. I mean, you have the former president as the defendant.
Right, and then Stormy Daniels walks in and it becomes a big show, right?
Right, but, I didn't see, they kept their faces expressionless pretty much. So you really couldn't tell what they were thinking. And today, I do have to mention, I was thinking about it, although I could not see the former president's face in that moment, before, when he walked into the room, he was in a really good mood.
Right.
Again, probably because he thought we were leaving for the day. And actually, another journalist turned to me and said, "Why do you think he's in such a good mood? You know, did new poll numbers come out or something?"
Right.
And then obviously that soured quickly. But when they said they had a verdict, he was sitting there, and I saw him with his eyes closed again. And that's been his demeanor this entire trial. I don't know whether it's by design. He wants to give that impression. We don't know. We've asked him.
Was he sleeping? Was he not?
Right. Other journalists have asked him, and he doesn't answer that question. So he was sitting there, no expression, before the verdict was read, seemingly, again, with his eyes closed.
Alice Gaynor, extraordinary. Final thoughts. You got to be back here on July 11th.
July 11th, 10 a.m. for sentencing. That's right. So I know the defense is going to be filing an appeal. They tried to file a motion for acquittal. That was denied right after the verdict was read. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. Christina Maurice, back to you in the studio.
Curious, one note here. The jurors, I'm imagining they hustled out of there pretty quickly, or did anybody speak to them? You know, there's been a lot of secrecy in keeping their privacy literally private. What became of them?
You're absolutely right, Maurice. This is an anonymous jury, not anonymous to the party. So the attorneys knew their names. That's how during jury selection, they were able to pull up some social media posts and dismiss certain jurors who had posted negative things about Mr. Trump online. So they've known their names all along. We, the press in there, do not know their names, and we were asked not to give physical descriptions of them when reporting that the jury had been selected. We could not report their places of employment. So what I'm told is they exit every day. They might be taken out by van, but they were not obviously allowed to speak during the trial. When dismissing them today, the judge said it was up to them now. I mean, now they're free to do whatever they might want. But again, we do not have their names. And so if they want to speak, that's going to be up to them because, again, they were anonymous for their protection.
And it was an extraordinary security contingent. I mentioned it a little briefly around here. But every time anything really happened, if Mr. Trump was leaving the building, everybody was shut down. And moments before the verdict was being read, the officer said to me, if you're going anywhere, don't, because this whole place is being locked down. But the NYPD officials here did a very good job, even in the park where people were yelling and screaming, which they've been doing for the last few weeks. We didn't have any problems, Maurice and Christine.
And if I can point out one distinction, you know, we covered the Harvey Weinstein trial here, and when the verdict was read for that, a rush of court officers came into that courtroom and surrounded him. Today, it was the same amount of court officers that we've seen the entire trial. Because it's been so secure and so safe, you might think maybe some extra will come in now that we know there's a verdict, but it was just the same amount. And again, there was no audible reaction in that courtroom, no outbursts from the defendant, from anybody. It was just a proceeding, you know, like anyone else.
And Maurice and Christine, it's still been very quiet in the last hour or so since the verdict.
Alice, Dick, as we continue here to watch Trump's motorcade traveling up the FDR. Alice, we talked a lot about Trump and his attorneys. We talked about the jurors. I'm curious to know if you were able to see any reaction from the prosecution's team.
Well, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, he did enter the courtroom once we knew there was a verdict. You know, he's only been in the courtroom a couple of times. I believe he was here for openings, and he was here 2 of the days that 2 of his employees took the stand, witness stand. 2 paralegals in his office were acting as custodial witnesses as well. So he was here in the courtroom to support them during their testimony, and again, he entered today. I could not see his face. I know that he's tweeted. I think we're awaiting a press conference he might be holding, but no visible reaction from prosecutors. One thing I did observe in the courtroom today, so this morning they're doing readback of testimony, and it takes a while. The defense's table almost seemed a little deflated, and other people noticed this as well. The former president was sitting there, eyes closed. A couple of his attorneys were hunched over, another was just staring straight ahead. And I compare that to the prosecution table. They were following along on the desk, you know, with the testimony, you know, like school children almost, you know, like following along with what the court reporters were, you know, reading back from the testimony. So it was an interesting day in observing body language and the response from both sides.
And speaking of response, I spoke to Arthur Aidala, who is not working for Trump, but he said Trump has asked him to come and work for him. And he said to me that he feels that the Trump team, he's obviously in touch with them, is very much ready for a lot of appeals. Because remember, this case, as I mentioned, me and Alice and I mentioned moments ago, it was very complex. And and that's why the jury had to go through a lot. But in all those complexities, Mr. Aidala told me, are possible appeals. And remember, if we have a sentencing on July 11th, appeal could go at least a year in this state, and that means that any kind of sentencing, even after that date, it all gets pushed off. The conviction technically gets pushed off until it goes through the appeal process. So we have a long way to go before anything can happen here, Christine Maurice.
Okay, that we do. Dick Brennan and Alice Gaynor, excellent reporting. Alice, you've been in the courtroom throughout the entire trial. Can't thank you enough for outstanding work. We can see more of it at cbsnewyork.com. Thank you guys so much. And as we look to the right of the screen right there, we saw the former president's motorcade. Looks like he got off the FDR and he's on the streets of Manhattan heading probably to his home. We'll keep you posted as to where that goes.
In the meantime, as for a response from the White House, well, President Biden is currently in Rehoboth Beach with his family and will not be holding a news conference.
But he did post on social media saying, quote, "There is only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Donate to our campaign today." Those are the words there of President Biden today.
As we continue our coverage, we want to go live to CBS 2's Derek Waller with reaction from near the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Derek, what have you seen?
Christine Maurice, good evening to you. You can probably hear behind me those anti-Trump protesters. They're going through every count and noting that each one of those counts landed with a guilty verdict. You can hear them right now. We're standing at Worth and Center Streets, and basically we're just south of the courthouse. North of us, Center Street is closed, shut down to traffic, of course, because of the historic nature of today's proceedings. Let's show you some video that we just shot a few moments ago showing some of the crowds that are stationed just outside the courthouse. I wouldn't say it's a large group of people, but certainly you do have protesters, both pro-Trump and anti-Trump. You see that sign there, Trump is guilty. And then down the block, actually down Worth Street a little bit closer toward the federal courthouses, you've got some pro-Trump protesters with their own signs as well. Police, we've noticed, have been trying to keep them separate. At one point, you did have somebody with a Trump flag run through this anti-Trump protest, and you saw the police respond to that. So far, relatively peaceful here. We did have a moment to speak with some of the protesters. Here's a little bit of what they had to say.
This is criminal, and what he did is really serious, and it was election interference, and I'm really glad the jury came in with their verdict.
We're both in shock, but I think it's actually going to help them. I think it'll bring attention to what a farce this was, and we're going to add support, and we're still going to win.
So as you saw there, you've got two people who are super engaged in the political system, and they're out here voicing their opinions. We're going to stay out here and monitor the situation outside the courtroom. Christine Maurice, back to you.
Okay, Derek Waller, thank you so much. We're going to go back to the chopper shot, Chopper 2, over the east side of Manhattan, and the former president is approaching his home there, Trump Tower, that is in the mid-50s, right off of Fifth Avenue, between 5th and Madison, getting to his home.
Building.
You can only imagine what that ride was like coming uptown after this kind of day, historic day and deflating kind of day for the former president.
Well, we heard Alice say that he did look a bit red-faced once they learned that the jury reached a verdict, and then she also mentioned that he just looked straight ahead while the various guilty verdicts were read on each of the 34 counts. So it is a very long trip from the courthouse over to the east side. There's the former president right there getting out of his SUV with his team surrounding him. We also saw his son, Eric Trump, at the courthouse. You can see him waving there to some of his, we would assume, his supporters. And as he continues to be very defiant, even in regards to this jury convicting him on all 34 counts today in this criminal case.
Also worth noting that within a couple minutes, he put out a fundraising letter right there 2 minutes before he spoke to the cameras. It was out there, and you can expect a lot more of that. Defiant and, quite frankly, angry disposition as he came out of the courtroom, and there he is waving to supporters and whomever there on Fifth Avenue as he gets ready to go inside.
A lot of the same body language that we've seen from him over and over again, even on the campaign trail, with his fist up in the air, thanking his supporters. and he is continuing along that same path.
And calling the whole thing a witch hunt, as he has from the start. All right, there's the former president getting to his home. Meantime, crowds gathered after the verdict in Times Square. We also have a crowd right there. That looks like the other side of Fifth Avenue from his home, right?
Exactly.
And it's tough to tell what that looks like there. Is Dan Rice available in Chopper 2? Dan, are you up there? Can you tell us what you see?
Yes, Maurice, what you saw when the former president came out of his SUV there, he walked over on 56th Street over to Fifth Avenue, and this is part of the crowd that he was waving to. This line, it's a little hard to see from the angle we have, as you can imagine, a lot of choppers up here, but this line extends from 56th Street almost up to 57th Street, the entire west side of Fifth Avenue, lined with the supporters, people trying to get a glimpse of the former president, but that's the crowd that you can see there that was waiting for a glimpse of the former president as he came back to Trump Tower here on Fifth Avenue.
And Dan, you can tell those are supporters, not protesters?
You know, we got here so quick, Maurice. It was a little hard to see. Most of them seemed to be supporters, but again, we didn't get a good look around the other side of the building to see if there are other signs or what have you out there. But it appeared to be a pro-Trump crowd as he approached them from 56th Street.
Got it. Okay.
And a good amount of news media as well there on the corner that we can see.
It appears to be peaceful. 56th and Fifth Avenue right there. All right, Dan, thank you. Meantime, the crowds did gather after the verdict in Times Square. CBS 2's Zania Maldonado is in Times Square right now with what people are saying there. Zania?
Well, Maurice and Christine, we've been talking to folks, and you know, here in Times Square, these are people from not only across the city, but the state, the country, even international folks, all weighing in with reaction to today's verdict. The first time a U.S. former president has been convicted of a crime. So, of course, a lot of people with a lot to say. And what I can add, though, is that the common denominator amongst all of the folks we spoke to, though, is confidence they say they have in the U.S. justice system. Take a listen.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me knowing Donald Trump. At the end of the day, I don't know if it's going to make a difference. He still may get reelected. Our country's kind of in a weird place, but it's disappointing, I guess. That's all I can say is it's disappointing.
It shouldn't matter who you are or what you do. If you do the crime, you deserve what's coming to you.
Everybody gotta, you know, they gotta follow the law. The law's not made just for certain people, it's made for everybody to follow.
It's insane. That's never happened before in history. So this is something that we're living, and I don't even know how this is going to turn out. I'm shocked. Honestly, I'm shocked.
And as you just heard, yes, some people say they're shocked. Others will say they're not shocked to see this come out. But another thing that people are adding is now they're going to be on the edge of their seats over the next couple of weeks, seeing how all of this plays out. And of course, we're going to stay on top of it. For now, we're live from Times Square. Zania Maldonado, CBS 2 News.
Zania, thank you.
All right, we're going to get into the legal and political implications right now, and there are many on both fronts. CBS 2 political reporter Marcia Kramer is here. So is Hofstra Law Professor James Sample. Before we get into all that, first I want to get your reaction. What do you think, Marcia?
I was actually surprised that they convicted on all 34 counts. I had a feeling that they might split the baby in half and maybe acquit on some and convict on some, but clearly the prosecution did a good job in their minds of building a case and having proof of everything that Michael Cohen was going to then testify to. So there was a carefully built case. So I thought that because they did it that way, that they would probably go for a conviction.
So even though he wasn't the most reliable witness, you're saying
they backed up everything before he ever got on the stand. They had witnesses that corroborated everything he was going to say. So when he finally got on the stand, and even they tried to shake his credibility, you had other witnesses who were credible who backed him everything that he said.
Yeah, Professor, what do you think?
I think what Marcia said is spot on, and I think that the prosecution really bookended the testimony by starting with David Pecker and ending with Michael Cohen. They were able to essentially prime the jury to hear that what Michael Cohen was saying when he was testifying was something that they'd already heard, was something that they'd already seen in the physical documentary evidence. The jury had already seen the document with Alan Weisselberg's handwriting saying, gross this up, which you wouldn't do if you were paying for
legal services. You would only do that if you were reimbursing somebody for a payment that they had made on your behalf.
So corroboration.
Corroborate.
When it comes to an appeal here, what is that going to look like going forward from the Trump team?
Well, the Trump team is certainly prepared for an appeal. It's going to take time. The first thing that's going to happen is that Donald Trump is going to have to meet with a probation officer who will begin the process of preparing a pre-sentencing report. Then there'll be the sentencing. But the appeals process, it goes through the New York State court system. So it'll go to the appellate division, then it would go to the New York Court of Appeals. I don't see an issue here that could go to the U.S. Supreme Court. It is conceivable that there's a due process concern that could be raised in a cert petition. I mean, they can certainly raise that. I think it'd be a bit of a Hail Mary. It will take time, Maurice.
But what grounds are they appealing on?
Well, certainly there are some legal grounds that, this was a relatively unprecedented case in terms of the way it was framed. Falsification of business records is a case that the New York District Attorney's Office brings all the time. That part's common. Elevating it to a felony is relatively common. Elevating it to felonies on the bases that these misdemeanors were elevated to felonies, the unlawful means. That's complex. It's a case of first impression. It's certainly a case involving a unique defendant, and those complexities will be areas that the defense will try and probe for their appeals.
By the way, I just want to make a point to you. It's not going to stop Donald Trump from trying to go to the Supreme Court,
of course,
where he already has a very strong conservative majority.
But what does it say that this was decided in a day and a half? And all 34 counts. To appeal something that was that decisive would seem to be a real uphill climb.
Well, they're certainly not going to be able to appeal the factual basis. I mean, the jury factual findings are secure. The only legal bases for an appeal would be questions about the underlying law. And, there's all this talk. Donald Trump talks about a rigged system.
He said it was rigged. He said it was a disgrace. He also said that they wanted a venue change at the very beginning of this. So he's bringing that up as well.
Right. But this is the thing. These were 12 jurors, and that's after the grand jury phase of citizens found that there were sufficient bases to bring the charge. Then you had 12 citizens of New York who heard the evidence. They were there for 5 weeks. They heard the evidence. They heard the testimony. They read the documents. They were careful and considerate. And even in the readbacks that we got yesterday and this morning from the court, an indication of a level of care. This is not a Joe Biden. Joe Biden has no control over the New York District Attorney's Office. That's Alvin Bragg. Alvin Bragg brought this case, and 12 jurors, American citizens, did their duty after 5 weeks of listening to this case. They're the ones who made these findings.
Now, what about the politics, Marcia? A lot of people are going to love this in a blue state. A lot of people are going to hate this, not just here, but across the country.
See, I think it's going to take some time for all of this to settle in and for people to decide what it means to them. But the key thing I think you have to realize is that politically in the presidential campaign, there are 7 battleground states, and that's where everybody's going to put their firepower. And one thing that CBS News polling has shown that in 3 of the battleground states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, they found out that about pre-verdict, that about 15% of the people there said that they might change their mind if he was convicted. Now, if that holds true, or if more people decide to change their mind once it sinks in that he's been convicted, that could give a real chance to President Biden and the Democratic team to come forward.
When you say change their mind, away from Trump?
Away
Trump
from
supporters
Trump,
go away from him if he's convicted?
So if you take a look at some of the recent polling in the 7 battleground states, Trump was ahead, as my recollection, in about 5 of the 7, Biden in 2. But now, there's wiggle room, and there's wiggle room that could give President Biden an in. It really is going to depend on how they pitch their campaign and how they decide to spend their campaign dollars. So we have to wait and see. But I do think that this is going to be something that's going to be highly contested. And Trump, by the way, is not going to go away silently.
No.
And he's going to be going there and saying the same things that we heard him say today. Witch hunt, rigged trial, Biden justice, all the things that he's been saying, he's going to say over and over and over again, because he believes one thing: rage sells, rage gets voters to the polls.
Grievance.
And so if he can get his people enraged and get them to go to the polls, that's the key.
The fundraising that has begun already.
Are you kidding?
Can you read us some of that?
Well, I mean, basically calls himself a, hold on a second.
It went out just minutes before he came to the microphone.
It went out, by the way, at 5:21.
And he spoke at 5:23.
So, I mean, he was obviously wasting no time. I think, obviously, he had already Give me 1 second to find it.
But Marcia, as you look at that, he was also bringing up the big issues that are facing our nation and also that are vital to the voters, and that is the economy, the border. You know, people can't even pay for their grocery bills, mortgage rates. He was already bringing that up today, and it appeared to be deflecting from what happened downtown.
Well, I think what he's trying to do is also change the debate. Instead of him being a convicted felon, he wants to say, what about the economy? What about what's happening at the border? What about the migrant crisis? Things that people care about. But what it says here, breaking from Trump, I am a political prisoner. And he says, stand with Trump. I was just convicted in a rigged political witch hunt, and I did nothing wrong. I could go on, but it's the same thing. It's a campaign fundraising letter. He's wasting no time because he really believes that this is the kind of thing that will get his voters to the polls. You know, turnout is everything.
Right.
And those claims by Donald Trump's campaign, not the truth. I just want to say.
No,
exactly.
This is his campaign.
Right.
You know, his.
How do you think that's going to land?
I think it's too early to tell. You know, there are people in his camp that really believe what he says, and then there are others who may want to take a step back and say, let me see how this plays out. Remember, he's going to be behaving however he's going to behave between now and the sentencing, and we have to wait and see how that happens.
Yeah, Professor, I'm wondering, this case was said to be the weakest of all the cases to be brought against Donald Trump. It went out, and in a day and a half, it was a slam dunk, if I may say that. So what do you make of the other cases going forward?
Well, the strongest case is the one that actually gets brought, as it turns out, right? I mean, the other cases, you know, Jack Smith has tried to bring them, but they're lodged, you know, the classified documents have been stalled by Judge Eileen Cannon. The January 6th case is essentially in a holding pattern right now because of the immunity appeal that has been at least successful in running out the clock, not necessarily successful on the merits. We don't have a decision from the Supreme Court. And then, of course, Georgia, the Fani Willis scenario created some delays. And so, in a sense, at this point, sometimes the strongest case you have is the one that you can actually get to trial, the one you can put before a jury, and that's what happened here.
But I also think you need to point one other thing out, and that is that this, because of the appeal process and everything else, may be the only trial that happens before the election on November 5th.
Right.
What about jail time? I don't think we've discussed that yet. Cy Vance said there's really, in his mind, there's no chance that Trump will see jail time.
I think it's highly, highly unlikely. He's a first-time offender. He's in his 70s, and he's one of the most well-known figures on the planet. He's not going anywhere. He's pretty easy to keep track of. I don't think that he will end up serving time for these offenses. But it is notable. You know, you think about the last 13 months. Found liable in civil cases for sexual abuse with E. Jean Carroll, found liable for defamation of E. Jean Carroll, found liable in the civil case for business fraud, you know, almost $500 million in civil judgments. But these felony findings take things to a different level. There's a difference between civil and criminal. And today, for the first time, a former president was convicted of felony criminal convictions.
There's one other point I should really make to you, and that is this, that given the politics of it, they could sentence him to home confinement. And if they do that, that could have a big effect on his ability to campaign.
Just a couple seconds here, Professor. What do you think of the judge's performance throughout?
The judge was in such a difficult position, Maurice, and yet all the people who seriously observed, not the rhetoric on the outside, not the claims and attacks, but the people who seriously observed this case, he made rulings that were favorable to both sides. You don't think the prosecutors wanted to play the actual Access Hollywood tape? I guarantee they wanted to play that tape. Right. They were allowed to introduce a transcript of it. They couldn't play the tape. The judge was measured. He was careful, he was balanced, and the jury really, really looked to him.
What grade do you give him?
An A+.
A+, okay.
Marcia Kramer, Professor James Sample, thank you both for your insight and comments.
Historic day. We're trying to catch our breath here. The former president found guilty on all 34 counts. Coverage continues next on the CBS Evening News.
New York jury found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in his landmark hush money trial. CBS News political director Fin Gomez joins us with more. Fin, first of all, something like this happens, campaigns, you know, rush to their text out or get you on the phone. What have you started hearing from the Trump camp?
Well, the Trump campaign plans essentially what we heard the president say today is what they expect him to say. We're not expecting any other events today. He's not rushing back to Mar-a-Lago, I'm being told. But I've asked if this will have a political impact on what they believe is the trajectory back to the White House. They feel that if anything, it helps the base. It pushes the base out there. The base is livid. They're fired up. They're falling into the narrative that we've heard Trump saying in and day out at 100 Center Street, that this is a witch hunt, that this is this is a political. There's been a political calculus underlying this whole operation. They feel it falls to that narrative. However, talking to the Biden folks or people close to the Biden campaign, they tell me that that essentially their sense, their perspective is to essentially stay out of it, not get into the mire, right?
Right. So, yeah, you don't want to get in the way of your opponent when your opponent's having troubles.
Exactly.
But man, going back to the Trump campaign, man cannot live by base alone, one might say, which is to say the base will no doubt see this as further persecution of a man they see as endlessly hounded by everyone, the media included. But what about the voters with whom Trump has trouble within even his own base, which is anybody who's not in the kind of Make America Great Again hardcore? What about those voters who would have been otherwise traditionally Republican voters?
Well, we have seen some polling that's come out in recent days. There's one out even today. There was a NewsHour Marist poll that said essentially that voters or likely voters would not be impacted. It really would have moved the dial one way or the other. For the most part, we're looking at those 7 battleground states, as you know, John, and the polling that we have seen shows that it's really not a top issue. But about those specific voters that you were referring to, and I would say, like, there's been a lot said about the Haley supporters, if you will, the sort of formerly McCain Republicans who are like traditional conservatives or even moderate, and to them, and speaking to top Democrats earlier today, those associated with the Biden campaign, they do feel that this helps their cause. They do feel that those who are on the bubble in those respective 7 states, especially, could have their decision impacted by this. Like, they're not expecting this. They're not expecting any sort of like fantasies here, or any sort of like a huge dial move, if you will. But will it have an impact? They feel yes. Will it have an impact with those persuadable Republican voters somewhere in the middle? They believe they do have a stronger argument now that this has happened. However, John, as you know, probably better than anybody, we have 5 months left until the November 5th election, right? The best thing for Trump politically is that there are 5 months left. The worst thing for Trump politically is that there are 5 months left, because that could be a
What do you think this does? Conventions ain't what they used to be, of course, but the sentencing is 5 days before the Republican convention. What do you think this does to that?
Just a few days before the convention, right? Just a few days before we were expected, or around the time, because they themselves said that we can hear who the vice presidential running mate will be around the convention, and just before the first debate that is happening. So we've never been here before, John. This is such an unprecedented place that we've been to, where I know we talked about it like ad nauseum now, but we've never seen this in American history. We've now never seen a convicted presumptive nominee of a major party who is leading in many polls that we've seen.
In the Democratic Party, if this happened, there would be endless rounds of hand-wringing. I mean, there's lots of hand-wringing going on in the Democratic Party right now without a criminal conviction. That's more their way of doing things. Do you expect anything like that on the Republican side? There is, of course, the anti-Trump. We can name the members of the anti-Trump wing. Many of them are former or are on their way out the door because the party no longer is interested in them. But do you see this, I mean, being a convicted criminal, despite what the former president is saying, having any new germination inside the Republican Party for any leader or any member of the House or Senate who might think, well, maybe I'm going to, react to this other than purely being on the president's side?
I think potentially, yes. To some degree, again, going back, not the base voter, not even some of these elected officials who are currently running. And as you know, there's a lot more territory now on the Senate side, if you will, Republicans running and trying to capture more seats in the Senate. Will this have an effect? Will this influence that voter? I think we have to wait to see how what this does. We did know John, that we did know that just a few days ago, I did speak to some top Democrats who are close to the Biden campaign who were nervous, apprehensive about Trump's standing in recent polls, apprehensive about the direction of the campaign. You know, what this does also is like we're not focused fully on this.
Yeah.
We're focused fully on this conviction, right? So, you know, that kind of goes to the side. And now that's going to get so much attention, their hope is that there will be more focus by these voters who may not be paying attention, who may be just kind of paying attention like peripherally.
It's a very good point. The low information voter, this is now on the screens of every TV and will be in the maybe breakthrough. That's really interesting. Finn Gomez, thank you so much.
Thanks,
CBS
Sean.
News political director. Daniel Horowitz joins me now. He's a partner at McLaughlin and Stern law firm, and he's a former Manhattan assistant district attorney. Thank you so much for being with us, Daniel. As a former assistant DA in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, what do you make of the verdict?
I'm not surprised. The DA put together a masterful case with tremendous amount of corroboration around Michael Cohen. They had witnesses to the hilt. They had tapes. They had documents. They did an extraordinarily thorough and comprehensive job. And the fact that the jury came back so quickly with a verdict, and frankly, the questions that they posed yesterday really sort of framed exactly what the DA wanted them to think about, which is the bookend of David Pecker and Michael Cohen corroborating each other about the most important elements of the crime.
So explain that bookend for people who are not fully versed on all the details of this case. What were the two underlying, or what were the most important underlying facts that were solidified? And just to remind people, Michael Cohen was a thoroughly compromised witness who spent his career lying as an employee for Donald Trump, was then convicted for lying, and then wasn't, didn't seem tremendously credible at times on the stand. Nevertheless, your point is there was corroborating evidence around those bookends. Explain what you think that they solidified in the minds of the jury.
Sure. I mean, the central allegation is that Donald Trump, along with Michael Cohen and David Pecker, orchestrated this conspiracy to help Trump get elected by suppressing unfavorable and unflattering stories and by paying off Stormy Daniels not to tell her story that Donald Trump had slept with her, Karen McDougal, the same thing. And David Pecker, as the publisher of the National Enquirer, was a critical player in that because there were stories from Stormy Daniels, from Karen McDougal, that, to use his word, the National Enquirer caught and killed, meaning that they went out, got the stories, paid those people money so that the stories would never run. And that was all intended to help Donald Trump in the days leading up to the 2016 election. And the bookends, you have David Pecker, longtime publisher of the National Enquirer, friend of Donald Trump, said he was a friend of Donald Trump when he testified, said he still liked Donald Trump, testifying. You also have Michael Cohen, the president's fixer, who by title was a lawyer, but really did all the dirty work. And he's the one who sort of put all of the details into execution that Trump had detailed to him, along with Trump's other lieutenants, Alan Weisselberg and others in the Trump organization.
Daniel, let me ask you this final question about this possible grounds for appeal on this question, which is the judge instructed the jury that as they considered the evidence and considered whether the former president falsified business records, they had to think about whether it was done in furtherance of covering up another crime, and that they could choose between three different kinds of crimes. One were state election laws, one was federal election laws, and then the third was other business forms, I guess also, and tax records. The argument from the Trump team is that's crazy, the kind of pick your lane way of turning this into a felony. Why is that not a good grounds for appeal?
I mean, I think that it's, as a lot of people have said, it's not a theory that's been well trod. And so as a result, any defense lawyer, whether it's Donald Trump's or anybody else, is going to say, hey, look, this is a novel theory, so we've got good grounds for appeal. The reason it doesn't really work, in my view, is because the fundamental crime that underlies the falsifying of business records, in other words, false entries were made in business records to cover up another crime, and that crime, as the judge instructed the jury, was a violation of New York State election law, which says that you can't engage in illegal conduct with an election by unlawful means. And it's that phrase, the unlawful means, that Trump and his team have seized on. And the prosecutors and the judge instructed the jury that there are these three different alternatives as to what unlawful means actually means. Now, I don't think that at the end of the day, the appellate division, which is the appellate court in New York State, is going to find much truck in Trump's argument on that point.
Daniel Horowitz, thank you so much for being with us. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins me now from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Scott, what's the read? What are you hearing from congressional leaders, or if not leaders, members of Congress reacting to this guilty verdict of the former president?
Yeah, John, first of all, the dividing line is pretty clear here on the reaction, and it's somewhat predictable. We're hearing the words corrupt, rigged, weaponized, and political in the statements from Republicans and Trump allies about the jury's decision. So many of them ascribing a motive to the Biden administration, despite the fact that that is a meritless claim, and that this was a local, not a federal prosecution brought by a prosecutor in Manhattan, approved by a grand jury of Mr. Trump's peers, and a conviction by a jury of Mr. Trump's peers. The Democrats are leaning into the opposite argument, one that you would expect, that this was a righteous prosecution, that it was a jury's voice and a jury's decision, and that Donald Trump is now not just a former president, but a convicted felon. Doesn't seem to be any surprises in the political reaction. I'll just note a couple small things that are worth mentioning. There was one Republican, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, criticized the prosecution. He's one of the few senators on the Republican side who voted to convict Donald Trump, impeach him in 2021. He criticized the defense for its strategy in this trial. And Larry Hogan, the Republican trying to win the nomination or to win the general election in the blue state of Maryland, said it's time for Americans to come together and stop being so divided by politics. A bit of an equivocation from somebody trying to run as a moderate.
Yes, and as if politics were a free-floating thing. There are some specifics to wrestle with today, but the former governor will have to do that on his own. Let me ask you something, Scott. You've covered a lot of trials. Remind us again what usually happens when somebody is convicted. My recollection from covering a few trials myself is they say, we respect the jury's decision and we will appeal because we think on the law we have a case. But there is some nod made to the process that you still then are going to have to be in as you work your appeal to get the guilty verdict overturned. A, do I have that right or wrong? And B, give me your historical perspective on how convicted members usually respond as a way to gauge the Trump response versus what the norm is.
That's a good question. Let's look at this huge set of cases we have that are Trump adjacent. The January 6 criminal prosecutions, those are in federal court. Sentencing happens through a very rigorous, traditional, months-long process, and we've heard any number of the defendants in that case, in those cases, question the political leanings of the jury and the venue. This destabilizing argument that jurors are political creatures who operate as political creatures when they're jurors. That's a destabilizing argument that has led to some appeals, none of which have been successful. In fact, an appeals court just this week, John, shot down a January 6 defendant's argument that he had a loaded jury from Washington, D.C. in his case. You see the same type of destabilizing arguments already popping up in the hours after the Trump conviction, that this was a liberal jury in Manhattan, that we can't trust the jury system. I don't know what the consequences of that are, John, but we saw the consequences of when they destabilized the integrity of American elections in 2020, and we're still feeling the pain of that to this day.
Yeah, it's a very good point. You can think even, I think, that the jury got it wrong. You can maybe even think the judge had wrong instructions. But to For lawmakers to make this leap and say, which, as you pointed out, has no merit and no evidence, that this is somehow connected to Biden, that seems to go a step further and engage in the kind of danger you're talking about, which is to sow doubt about the very system. And in our politics, we have seen, because doubt was sowed about the outcome of the 2020 election, that for a certain group of people in the country, when there is doubt, they take matters into their own hands. You've covered the people who took matters into their own hands when they had this gasoline thrown on the floor, when they were told that the system was rigged. How, when they were told the system was rigged, we have, sorry, Scott, with that windup, we now have Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg at the microphones.
Good evening. First and foremost, I want to thank the jury for its service. Jurors perform a fundamental civic duty. Their service is literally the cornerstone of our judicial system. We should all be thankful for the careful attention that this jury paid to the evidence and the law and their time and commitment over these past several weeks. 12 everyday New Yorkers, and of course, our alternates, heard testimony from 22 witnesses, including former and current employees of the defendant, media executives, book publishers, custodians of records, and others. They reviewed call logs, text messages, and emails. They heard recordings. They saw checks and invoices, bank statements, and calendar appointments. This type of white-collar prosecution is core to what we do at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. In the 1930s, District Attorney Thomas Dewey ushered in the era of the modern, independent professional prosecutor. For now nearly 90 years, dedicated professionals in this office have built upon that fine tradition. A major part of our practice during that nearly 90 years has been public integrity work, including cases involving jurists, local and state electeds, public servants, and others. I want to thank this phenomenal prosecution team, embodying the finest traditions of this office: professionalism, integrity, dedication, and service. They are model public servants, and I am proud and humbled to serve side by side with them. The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor. I want to conclude by expressing deep gratitude to the NYPD and the officers of the Office of Court Administration for securing the courthouse, all of our safety, making sure the courthouse and all of the other matters that are important in their own right continued seamlessly. They will continue to be and have always been incredible partners. Thank you.
And do you plan to request a prison sentence?
Donald Trump's multiple violations of the gag order that was in place should factor into that request at all?
The judge scheduled a sentencing for July 11th. We will speak in court in that time. He also set a motion schedule. We will speak in our court filings as we've done throughout this proceeding.
Donald Trump has repeatedly targeted you personally and members of your prosecution team. Do you have a response to the former president after this trial is concluded?
I do not.
In February, you decided not to bring a case against Donald Trump. You criticized that. You criticized when you vetted him in March 2023. You criticized when people really started to understand that case. How do you think of all that now, seeing the results of that? Can you kind of put that in context with your personal history?
I did my job. Our job is to follow the facts and the law without fear or favor. And that's exactly what we did here. And what I feel is just gratitude to work alongside phenomenal public servants who do that each and every day in matters that you all write about and make the press, and in lots of matters that you don't. I did my job. We did our job. Many voices out there. The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken.
Could I ask Mr. Steinglass, many people said the prosecution was masterful and flawless. Just want to know how you feel at this moment. Sorry.
I'll let you
how do you feel?
Mr. Steinglass, I think some of you probably saw him speak for a little bit the other day. So he's done his job, as has this team. And he just told me, tell him how I feel. I think you said that. I will just say enormous gratitude. You know, our system, I talked about the jurors at the beginning of my remarks. We have a phenomenal system. 12 everyday New Yorkers. They listen to the judge's directions. They follow the evidence. You saw them in court every day. They were careful and attentive. And so I feel deep gratitude to work alongside them, to be a part of this system. And I just want to echo that this is what we're doing every single day. I mean, during this trial, just this week, right, a ghost gun indictment, Grimaldi's wage theft plea resolution, sex crimes, convictions, all sorts of work that's being done by phenomenal public servants. So we're before you today on this obviously consequential matter, but this is what we do every day. We follow the facts and the law without fear or favor.
If a jail sentence is in the cards, it is likely that Trump and his attorneys would seek a stay on enforcement of that sentence pending appeal. If that were the scenario, would your office object to staying the sentence?
I'm going to let our words in court speak for themselves when we get to the sentencing matter. I'm not going to address hypotheticals. They raise arguments, we'll respond. And I think your question really underscores an important point. This is an active, ongoing matter, right? We have other phases of this going ahead. We will continue to do our speaking about this matter, about issues like that in court.
All right, last one.
From day one, kind of the viability of this case has been questioned in all sorts of media outlets, all over the place, including from the defendant himself. Can you respond to any of that, how you feel now that you've gotten the conviction?
So my response, again, is I did my job.
You've been listening to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg discuss the guilty verdict in Donald Trump's criminal trial. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins me again from Washington. Scott, he defended the jury system, didn't defend it, praised it, said this is what the Manhattan District Attorney's office does every day. What did you take away from the Manhattan District Attorney?
First of all, the phrase he used, that the only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, because there are no shortage of voices in.
And it's a hallmark of the tradition of this office that I'm proud to lead. And I don't want to go into the whole body of litigation, but we now have a federal court decision ruling on the legal theories. We had a state court decision on the omnibus motions. But most importantly, today we have the most important voice of all, and that's the voice of the jurors. They have spoken. Donald J. Trump has been convicted of 34 counts of of falsifying business records. Thank you.
District Attorney, your office has been investigating this case since
Are you concerned about retribution if Trump is elected president?
You went to the Supreme Court twice. Any comment on that?
On 34 felony counts.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team. Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate. Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing, bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else.
This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original. 48 hours. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your...
It is an historic night in Manhattan. Former President Trump is a convicted felon after being found guilty by a jury of his peers.
After 5 weeks of testimony, a verdict was handed up in the hush money trial just after 5 p.m. tonight. This is the first criminal trial of a former U.S. president. The jury of 7 men and 5 women ruled Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. During the trial, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg's team argued Trump was part of a hush money scheme involving adult film star Stormy Daniels. It was all in an effort to suppress damaging information before the 2016 election.
We have team coverage for you set up in Lower Manhattan this evening. We've already heard from the major players in the case, including the former president himself, and DA Bragg just spoke out a few moments ago as well.
CBS 2's Alice Gaynor was one of about 60 journalists with a seat in the main courtroom, and she has been there every day of this trial, which began on April 15th.
And CBS 2's Dick Brennan also downtown right now. They kick off our team coverage this evening. Dick and Alice.
Christina and Maurice, the protesters are still shouting in the park around us, but all the real drama, Alice, was inside that courtroom when those counts were read. What was it like, this really extraordinary moment?
That's right, and you know, it was dramatic just because around 4:14, the judge came in, we hadn't heard from the jury all day, and he said, I'm going to give them a few more minutes, and then I'm going to dismiss them at 4:30. So the note was at 4:20. We didn't hear it until after 4:30. The judge said, I just received a note from the jury. They've reached a verdict. They would like some more time, about 30 minutes, to fill out the forms. Is that okay? There was an audible gasp in the courtroom from journalists and members of the public because we thought jurors were getting dismissed for the day. That's why that moment in particular was dramatic. However, when the verdict itself was read, it was quiet in that courtroom. All you could hear was the furious typing that journalists were doing. Members of the public were sitting behind me. Court officers had already instructed them, no outbursts of any kind, and they were quiet. We could not see the former president's reaction because they cut the video feed. What I mean by that is in the front of the courtroom, they have about 4 large monitors. We are sitting behind him, so obviously we cannot see his face. But if we use binoculars and if we look at those monitors, there's a camera facing the defense table, facing the judge, facing the prosecution, not facing the jury because they are anonymous, but we can usually see his expression if you look closely at the monitor and use binoculars. So we could not see in that moment. Before that moment, he was sitting there expressionless, eyes closed. After the verdict was read, as he was exiting the courtroom, I was sitting close to the middle aisle. So I had a shot of him when he was walking out. He went to reach for his son, Eric Trump, who has been in the courtroom a few times, and his face was red. He was sweating, and he looked obviously very angry. He walked out, and then he addressed the cameras in the hallway.
Yeah, moments later he addressed them. We have that. Let's hear from the former president right now.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Alice, you said what the former president looked like as he walked out. What were the jurors doing? Did they look nervous? How were they reacting?
You know, they've kept quite the poker face throughout this entire trial. We really didn't see many expressions, facial expressions from them at all. They've been paying attention, and they exited the courtroom. They did not look in his direction. When they enter the courtroom each day, they also don't look at him. They don't look at the prosecution's table either, though. Sometimes there's one gentleman who looks at him and looks at both tables, but today everyone had their heads down, walked right in, which again is not unusual. That's typically what they do. They're an anonymous jury, Dick, so we don't know if we're going to hear from them because we do not know their names. The attorneys knew their names, but we do not. And some of them, I want to point out, 2 were not born here in the United States. One was from Lebanon, one was from Ireland, and they also have various occupations. 2 are attorneys.
2 attorneys, one who said he didn't know much about criminal law.
Civil litigator
Right.
and a corporate attorney, and they said during selection, I don't know much about criminal law. So it would be interesting to know how that played an effect in the jury deliberation room. You know, whether those lawyers were able to help at all, but perhaps not because they asked for a readback of some of the instructions this morning from the judge's instructions to the jury.
Now, you had 20 plus witnesses there. Some of them, as you described, sort of mundane people talking about ledgers. But then Stormy Daniels will come in another day. Michael Cohen would come in another day. What was that up and down in that courtroom? And you never really knew what was coming next, right?
You know, I think people were bracing themselves for explosive testimony from Michael Cohen, but that just wasn't the case. He kept the same calm tone and demeanor, even as on cross-examination the defense tried to, catch him in certain moments, even though defense attorney Todd Blanche at one moment raised his voice in a really high pitch and, called him a liar. He never broke from his even tone when he was testifying on the stand. As for Stormy Daniels, when she first got up there, she was talking very quickly and a few times had to be told,
They said she was a little nervous, they thought she was. Yeah.
And she was going into perhaps a little bit of too much detail. The defense was objecting to certain things surrounding the alleged
very
act
tawdry,
between them.
too much, right?
Right. But for the most part, I wouldn't say there was a moment where there were any, major theatrics or drama in that courtroom. It very much felt like just a proceeding that was happening, if
And
that makes sense.
Quite the opposite from the former president, who many described they thought he was sleeping half the time.
You know, unless you're standing next to him, we can't say for certain he was sleeping, but we noticed his eyes were closed a lot. And actually, I noticed, now I can't remember, the day's been very long, whether it was today or yesterday, his head slumped over at one point, and I thought to myself, he's got to be sleeping. But I don't know if that's by design. You know, we don't know. We tried asking him, the reporters in the hallway, were you sleeping? Do you have your eyes closed on purpose? We don't know whether that was his way of, you know, kind of protesting what was going on. I don't know how that played with the jury. I mean, the jury we can't see his face because we're behind him, but the jury has a full view of everything.
And this is a former president. You know, they had a tremendous weight on them. You know, they knew the world was literally watching. And then apparently, though, like many jurors in New York, they just did their duty, right?
That's right. And now it's up to the judge for sentencing July 11th at 10 a.m. But back to the jury for a moment. You may remember jury selection took 4 days. They would bring in a pool of prospective jurors, 96. I think it was a second pool of 96. Dozens were excused because they were asked if they could be fair and impartial. Many said they could not, and so they were excused. There were a few that seemed to be selected, and then they thought about it overnight, came in. They were very stressed. They were very anxious. They said, I can't do this. So these jurors, what's interesting is sometimes in a trial, an alternate will have to come in for one reason or another. There was no need for the alternates in this trial. Every juror was there on time.
Yeah.
That's another thing.
Early.
Early. I mean, they did their job.
And another thing around this courthouse, and you had Harvey Weinstein trial, or a few, at least some appearances here. Menendez also here. And Trump. I mean, it was somewhat of a three-ring circus going on here, and kind of still is tonight.
And you know, that's the same courtroom where where that trial took place. So same exact one, and he had an appearance yesterday, and they had to move him to a different courtroom. And of course, Menendez, as you mentioned, is around the corner at federal court.
All right.
But right now, it's pretty quiet here, we have to say.
Finally, one more big day in July, and you will be there, no doubt.
That's right.
All right. Christina, Maurice, back to you.
Hey, guys, just one more thing for Alice. I mean, you've sat through every last detail of this case, start to finish. You digested every morsel. Did today surprise you in any way, the kind of speed that this came down with?
It did not, Maurice. Again, we can never predict when a verdict is going to come in, what the jury is thinking. But I said to a couple of people, you know, you're talking to other journalists online in the mornings. We have to get here so early before court even opens. And I said, I don't know. I think it's today. And other people thought, no, it's going to be tomorrow. Some other people, some attorneys and a retired judge thought it would be next week. So it was today. But again, I mean, you know, no inside knowledge.
You never know what a jury's going to do, as you know, Maurice and Christine.
Exactly. You never know. Okay, guys, thank you. Excellent work and insight there. We'll come back to you soon. Appreciate it.
We want to continue our special team coverage now of this conviction of former President Trump.
As soon as the guilty verdict was read on all 34 counts, the crowd started reacting outside the courthouse. CBS 2's Derek Waller live now with more on the reaction. Derek.
And Maurice, Christine, you know, Dick just mentioned a three-ring circus, and that's a little bit of what we had out here about an hour or so ago. We're standing at Center and Worth Streets, and things have really calmed down, as they mentioned. Behind me, you see that Center Street is back open to traffic. About an hour ago, it was shut down, but we can show you a little bit of what that looked like a little while ago. You can see on your screen some of the anti-Trump protesters that had been gathered here down the street. Police were kind of keeping them separate, but you had some pro-Trump protesters as well. Very vocal, but I would say it's very small groups of protesters. We did speak with some of them a little while ago. Here's a little bit of what they had to say.
This is criminal, and what he did is really serious, and it was election interference, and I'm really glad the jury came in with their verdict.
We're both in shock, but I think it's actually going to help them. I think it'll bring attention to what a farce this was, and we're going to add support, and we're still going to win.
So that's a little bit of a flavor of the different opinions that we got out here. But again, not a lot of protesters, and now it's really dwindling. I would say right now there's more press than protesters, which is often the case with these situations. But yes, an historic day, and really it's quieting down as the evening goes on. Maurice, Christine, I'll send it back to you.
Okay,
all right,
Derek Waller, thank you so much. And we saw just a few minutes ago Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg speaking for the first time since the verdict, using words like gratified and respect and honor and all these sorts of words, talking about the work that they put into it and the team that he says he's so proud of.
Absolutely. The first thing he mentioned was the jurors. CBS 2's Tim McNicholas is live in Lower Manhattan with what else Bragg had to say today. Tim?
Right, Christina, Maurice, we have heard Trump try to paint this whole trial as something that was unfair and unique to other trials. Bragg very deliberately tried to describe it as a case that he says he handled just like any other. He also described the jury at least twice as, quote, everyday jurors or everyday New Yorkers. He said this is the kind of white-collar prosecution that is core to what his office does. And as you mentioned, he also thanked his prosecuting team and the jurors. I think we have a soundbite from what he said earlier. If we could play that right now, that'd be great.
Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election.
So we often learn more from these press conferences from the question portion than we do from the opening statement. But today, DA Bragg really only took a few questions. He was giving very measured responses to those questions as well. He was asked at one point if he has a response to the criticism and insults that Trump has thrown at him throughout this whole process. He simply said, no, I do not. He was also asked if he will request prison time for Trump. And he said that the judge has requested, or scheduled, I should say, a sentencing for July. And he simply said that him and his prosecuting team will speak in court at that time. No doubt the rest of the country will be anxiously awaiting and listening to see what he says in July.
Tim, during his news conference just moments ago, he did make a point to mention, like, listen, this is what we do every day here at the DA's office. We try these cases, we follow the facts, and this is what we do every single day. It seemed as though he was really trying to minimize the gravity of what took place here today.
Right, and I think that is in direct response to what Trump and his allies have been saying. They've been doing the complete opposite, trying to make this out to be a case or a trial that is totally unique and unlike any other, and that may have been handled unfairly in some way. Well, Bragg took this very deliberate approach today of doing the complete opposite, saying this is a case that he handled like any other. He even went into the history of the DA's office a little bit and how they have handled over the years certain cases like this, white-collar crimes, which again, he said, white-collar prosecutions like this are at the core of what his office does day in and day out. And then there was an interesting moment when the lead prosecutor, Steinglass, was given an opportunity to answer a question. Take us through how that played out, Tim. Yeah, if I recall correctly, I don't think he actually responded to the question. He let Alvin Bragg do all the talking today. Again, Bragg was very measured in his responses. There's a good reason for that, I'm sure. He probably does not want to say anything that will taint public opinion or somehow give Trump more fuel for any of this, but he was very deliberate in the way he responded, and again, he only responded to a few questions today.
All right, interesting moments there. Tim McNicholas, thank you so much with the district attorney's reaction tonight. We're going to take a break here. When we come back in just a moment, we'll bring you reaction from Trump Tower.
All right, welcome back to our continuing coverage here of the conviction of former President Donald Trump. As you can imagine, there is reaction all over the city. Chopper 2 over Trump Tower right now, where we do see some people outside of the apartment complex there. We can't really tell if they are protesters or supporters. However, we can say that a caravan of cars, the same cars that we saw the former president transported in from the courthouse to Trump Tower, are still outside his apartment. Let's go to CBS 2's Dan Rice. He's overhead. Dan, what are you seeing?
Well, at this point, Christine, what we're looking at is the caravan that you spoke of. It appears that the former president will be coming back out to those cars. Where he may be going, it's not clear at this point. We're just going to get around this one building here. And usually what we've noticed over the different trials that we've covered is when these cars are all lined up here and you see that one gentleman with the door open to the back of the vehicle, the arrival of the former president is pretty imminent, so we're pretty sure they should be coming out here momentarily. But as you said, across the street over on 5th Avenue, we have seen a large group of people still gathered outside here, more towards the West 56th Street side of the intersection. Not clear if it is just a mix of media members and supporters or protesters. We've seen a bunch of people standing there on the sidewalk. It's been relatively peaceful out here, though, for most of the day. That's a good thing from when we've been out here. But again, we're just going to keep our eye over here on East 56th Street and waiting to see if the former president does jump back into that car and where he's going to head off to when he leaves Trump Tower.
Right, Dan Rice, thank you for that update. And we are also on the ground there outside of Trump Tower.
And that's where CBS 2's Dave Carlin is, right there at 56th and 5th Avenue. Dave, what do you see?
Well, right here, street level and on the sidewalk. I'm going to begin by showing you the scene over this way because you'll see a lot of American flags here on the west side of 5th Avenue between 56th Street and 57th Street. And we're also going to talk about that 6:15 arrival here when the former president arrived at his residence right here, Trump Tower, and people made a lot of noise. We've been talking about whether or not this would be protesters one way or the other, and actually it's both sides and a lot of tourists as well, and some tourists asking what's going on here with a lot less passion about the topic. And then let's hear from some of the people that we gathered up out here on the sidewalk and talked to.
But I guess everything will pull through. It's Trump. He always does. A great guy. Besides what everybody says about him, I think he's going to make America great again.
As him, as everybody else, we should all be, treated fairly in the justice system. And this whole thing is just crooked. It's so wrong. I support him so much because he's for us. He's genuinely for us.
That took a lot of courage for that jury to come back with that kind of a charge against him. I just think it's amazing.
To me, it's very clear. It's very clear that he's guilty.
People out here, despite their political persuasion, they want to know what's next. What we do know is that the sentencing hearing is July 11th. But people want to know something beyond that, like the schedule where the former president will be at any given time as we lead up to that. And of course, that's something that's not completely hammered down or even figured out. And of course, even what's going on tonight, we don't know for sure. And that's why we're here to see when he exits his residence, Trump Tower, where we are live. Dave Carlin, CBS 2 News.
All right, Dave, thank you. And we are told that moments ago, the former president did jump into the car and take off. Chopper 2 is overhead. This is Dan Rice giving us a look right now on the ground. Dan, what do you see? Where are they going?
And Maurice, as Dave was talking there, we did see the former president exit the building, get into the back of that SUV that we were talking about. Now they're heading out 56th Street. Typically what they'll do is that they're going back over towards the east side of Manhattan. They'll make that left-hand turn you see, going up to Madison Avenue, get back on the 57th Street, work their way over towards the east side. But again, it's going to be a little hard to get around the buildings here. But at this point, we do not have any word yet as to where he may be going. I did take a little peek over to LaGuardia Airport. airport. That's where the Trump airplane usually sits. And from what I can tell from the distance that we were looking at, the airplane does not appear to be ready to go for a flight. So it's not clear yet where in the city or where in the tri-state the former president could be heading to at this time, but we'll do our best to follow him through the city. Maurice and Christine.
Okay, Dan, as best you can tell, I guess you can't tell right now. The buildings are in the way, but they're just following traffic like anybody else, right? They don't get to go through red lights?
You know, it was when he left the courthouse, they had the police escort, and they were going through the intersections. They did have the police blocking off the intersections, but with this motorcade, when we saw it leave a few seconds ago, I didn't notice the police escort in front of the motorcade. So when we catch back up with it, we'll try to get an idea if they are running interference and blocking off the intersections, or if they just have to sit in traffic like he did when he came up the Trump Tower a few hours ago.
Okay.
All right, Dan. Well, just some of the possibilities, just basing this judgment on past instances. He's gone and he's done fundraisers after big days, you know, and setbacks like this. He's also met with supporters privately in instances like this. So we don't quite know where the former president is heading, but according to Dan, given the fact that his private airplane is not on the tarmac at the airport, or awaiting his arrival anyway, we can just assume that he is heading somewhere in the city. And of course, we will continue to keep an eye on that situation.
We do know the fundraising emails are out.
They are.
They are certainly.
With a vengeance. 3 so far since the guilty verdicts were handed up.
That's right. All right, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll hear what Michael Cohen has had to say after the verdict, right after this. Just a few moments ago, as we get into the aftermath of the Trump verdict here, we saw Michael Cohen leave his Manhattan apartment.
CBS 2's Naveen Dhaliwal is live there now. Naveen, did he have any comment?
Yeah, Christine, Michael Cohen had a lot to say in court, but as he left his Upper East Side apartment just around 7 o'clock, that was about 25 minutes ago, he had nothing to say. He walked out, our cameras caught him, out of the front door of his apartment here on Park Avenue. At one point, he looked at our cameras, and then he got into a livery SUV, a black SUV. Now, Cohen was a key witness, as you all know, in this case, telling the jury that he had intimate knowledge of that hush money payments that were made before the 2016 election. Cohen, known as a self-described fixer before Trump became president, and during this case, Cohen made a became a fierce critic of his now former boss. Now, in the court, you may remember, his testimony really nailed a lot of this case, where he said back in October 2016 he paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 of his own money, of his pocket money, in exchange for her silence. Now, prosecutors say Cohen received 11 checks from Trump that were falsely classified as legal fees to cover up the deal with Daniels. And Cohen testified that Trump had approved of this plan to reimburse him. Now, it's unclear what Cohen was thinking as he left his apartment. It's unclear where he was going at this time, but being a lawyer himself and being very close to this case, he might have some sort of an inkling of what the outcome of this trial may have been. Back to you.
Dhaliwal, thank you so much. Nothing from Michael Cohen just yet. All right, we will move on here to see some of the video as the former president left his apartment there on 56th Street at 5th Avenue, getting into the back of a vehicle with the escort of the Secret Service. He then went on 56, made a left up Madison, and that's where the chopper then followed him to points unknown. At this point, we're not sure if he's going to get to LaGuardia to get out of town. Dan Rice told us that it didn't appear that the chopper, or rather his private plane, is ready for takeoff or ready to leave just yet. So we'll keep an eye on that for you.
Absolutely. It is a quick, though, turnaround, because we saw him arrive there at his apartment building after 6 o'clock tonight, and just over an hour spending time there to regroup and then off to his next destination. Of course, we'll try to figure out where that is and get that information to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, we will hear from our political and legal analysts about what comes next.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man.
Donald Trump's reaction this afternoon, right after the verdict today, guilty on all 34 counts. Going to get into the legal and political implications of all of this, and there are many.
Joining the conversation, CBS 2 political reporter Marcia Kramer, and also law professor from Hofstra, James Sample. Welcome to you both. Quite a day here in New York City. Your reaction to this overwhelming and undeniably guilty verdict?
It's an extraordinary day. It's history. It's not necessarily the history, the kind of history that the country wants to make necessarily. Certainly not going into it, but it is a remarkable, remarkable thing. And I really think a lot about the jurors who spent 5 weeks in that Manhattan courtroom, listening to the evidence, looking at the documents very carefully, listening to all the witnesses. And I think about the job that the New York District Attorney's Office did here, particularly in the waning days. Joshua Steinglass a couple days ago going in past 8 p.m. and those jurors who had been there early on in the morning listening to testimony, locked in their seats, not able to talk to each other about the case, listening to all of this narrative. And when it all piled up, you started with David Pecker, you had Michael Cohen at the end, and in between, it was almost like a staccato presentation. There were bombshell witnesses and then relative unknowns, people we'd never heard of, but those people oftentimes were the ones who had the documentary evidence. They were the ones who had the phone call records, the meeting records, the opportunities, the wire transfers with the handwritten notes of the CFO. That kind of a staccato presentation ended up being extraordinarily effective.
And then the DA at the end, he said he's proud of his team. He went on to really congratulate them. And then at the end, he said, I did my job and they did theirs. What did you make of his reaction afterwards?
I thought it was a remarkably understated and sort of restrained statement on his part. You know that this has to be something that in his mind he considers a crowning achievement, and it's a historic moment for him, for the country, and he's a big part of bringing it about. But he's also aware that this is going to be a process and it's going to take time. So he said, for example, in response to a question as to whether or not he'd be seeking incarceration for the former president, he said, we'll address that on July 11th when we speak at the sentencing hearing. This is a measured, careful approach, and it's indicative of how the DA's office handled the entire case.
And Marcia, because he can't politicize this, he needs to be careful, because that's exactly what Donald Trump is doing.
Well, he can't politicize it, but you have to also look at this as a political victory for Alvin Bragg, because everybody said of all the cases that were brought, this was the weakest case. And the fact that he at first wasn't going to try the case, and then looked at the evidence again and said, I'm going to bring it, and everybody criticized him for doing it, and then he gets a victory. This is, remember, he has to stand for re-election too, so this is a big political victory for Alvin Bragg, and I know he's not going to take a victory lap, but people will be talking about it for months to come.
Speaking of the politics here, we've seen Donald Trump sent out at least 3 fundraising emails in the last 2 hours since the verdict has been read. What are we expecting to happen next here?
Well, first of all, he is trying to raise as much money as possible and capitalize on the, quote, rage of his supporters that they will contribute money to him. Remember, there's something very interesting going on. Actually, even though with all his support, Joe Biden has raised more money so far than Donald Trump. And so he wants to use this to raise a whole bunch of money to use in the campaign. But again, what we have to ask ourselves is this: what effect politically is this going to have? Right. And I think it has to still sink in people's minds, and people have to start asking themselves, do we want a convicted felon as the President of the United States? I mean, he stands convicted. So the question then becomes, where is this going to have an effect? the 7 battleground states, which until recent polls, Trump was leading in 5 of the 7 states. But we have to take a look at polls in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Now, CBS polling has indicated, and this is before it happened, that about 15% of voters, Republican voters, said they might change their mind about Trump if he was convicted. Now, we don't know whether that holds up after the conviction, but it gives wiggle room for Joe Biden and voters for Joe Biden to go after, because even though Trump was ahead in those states, he was only ahead by 4 or 5 points.
And those states are everything. The swing states are everything.
States, they're everything.
In the election.
And if even 2 or 3 points changes, Joe Biden can win.
That's true. Professor, you were talking about the fact that convicted of these charges, you can still run. You can still run for president. Can you vote for yourself? And what is the quirk that allows that to be the case?
It's a great question, Maurice. And, you know, the Constitution is an extraordinarily short document. You think about this document. It's been around for basically 250 years, and it's held the country together. It is the framework of a nation, but it is extraordinarily short when you consider the amount of work that it does. Article 2 sets out the qualifications for the presidency. You have to be a natural-born citizen. You have to have attained the age of 35 years. Beyond that, Amendment 22 was adopted to essentially establish term limits for the presidency. You can't have served two terms already, right after FDR. Other than that, the Constitution doesn't set any requirements for the office. It's up to the voters. And so being a convicted felon is not disqualifying in terms of running for office, even though in many states, being a convicted felon would prevent you from voting for yourself. Now, because Donald Trump votes in Florida, and because Florida honors the law of the state in which you were convicted, which is New York.
We're following.
And because New York is relatively progressive on these issues, and only felons who are actually incarcerated are prevented from voting, Donald Trump gets to vote in Florida by benefit of New York law.
Well, there we go.
Okay.
Right, complete circle there.
Crystal clear. We fully get it.
So I don't mean to interrupt, but I'd like to talk about this appeal. The defense has made it clear that they plan to appeal immediately, and I'd like to get your thoughts because, you know, Trump immediately said, you know, this is a disgrace, this is rigged. He also mentioned they didn't allow a change of venue. Do you expect these are all things that could be brought up in support of an appeal?
I think those are the arguments he'll make outside the context of the litigation. You know, for example, he says, oh, why, they wouldn't give us a change of venue or in a jurisdiction where we're at 5 or 6%. What is he referencing at 5 or 6%? He's talking about his polling numbers in Manhattan. If you don't want to be tried in a particular jurisdiction, don't commit crimes in that jurisdiction. There's no venue rule that is a function of your polling numbers in that a change of venue based on polling numbers. Think about if that were our legal system. Right. It's just not. I think his lawyers will make strong legal arguments. I don't think they'll be successful. I think they have arguments based in the law. They're not going to be able to overturn the jury's fact-finding. That's sacrosanct, right? The domain of the jury is to listen to things and determine things like credibility, to weigh the evidence. That's what the jury did. If the Trump team is going to pursue these appeals, which they absolutely will, they will focus on the unprecedented nature of these particular falsification of business records charges being elevated to the felonies that they are because of the pursuit of unlawful means, additional unlawful means. And that here is either the federal election laws, New York state tax laws, or other falsification of business records. And so that is the area that initially, and you know, people talked about this being the weakest of the 4 cases initially. That was the perceived weak point. But the district attorney's office got over the hurdle. They got over that hurdle. They brought this case. They were successful. And it will be difficult, not impossible, but it will be very difficult to challenge this verdict on appeal.
I mean, the next place they go to the appellate level in New York, then the state's highest court, the Court of Appeals. Right. Could they end up in federal courts in any way, shape, or form? Could you imagine that?
In order to get jurisdiction in a state, in an appeal from a state conviction, it has to go all the way up. You have to exhaust your state appeals. So as you say, it would go to the appellate division in New York, then to the New York Court of Appeals. And then if you can find a federal issue that would result in a reversal of your conviction, you can file for a petition for certiorari, but you can only do that on a federal basis. Most of this case, the vast majority of the case, is New York law. They can try and make a due process federal claim out of it. It'll be a long shot.
Marcia, you know, Donald Trump did not testify in this case. Do you think he regrets that?
I don't think he regrets it one bit. I think that if he had gone onto the stand and they could prove that he perjured himself, that would have been a huge felony. So they wanted to avoid that. But one thing I'd like to talk to you about in terms of the court situation, it's going to take so long for this appeal process to be carried out. I mean, first you go to the appellate division and you argue, and then they rule, and then you go to the Court of Appeals, and then you argue and you rule. By the time all this is done, we're going to be past the election, we're going to be into January. He may be president, he may not be president, and whether he wins or not will probably also affect, you know, where this goes and whether the other cases are being brought. Because remember, there are 3 other cases that they could actually be tried on. He could actually be tried on.
All right, so much more to sort through here. Marcia, thank you. Professor, thank you as well. Great insight. We're going to take a break here. We're back with much more of the aftermath of the verdict. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's take you to Times Square right now. CBS 2's Zania Maldonado there with what people are saying as they gather there tonight. Zania?
Well, as you know, Maurice, here in Times Square, you're going to see folks from not only all over across the city, state, country, but the globe. And everybody has something to say about a U.S. former president being convicted for the very first time. Some people say they are shocked. Some people are not so shocked. One of the common denominators, though, among the folks that we spoke to is confidence in the U.S. justice system. And many of them, though, say they're now on the edge of their seats waiting to see what is going to happen next. Take a listen.
It's insane. That's never happened before in history. So this is something that we're living, and I don't even know how this is going to turn out. I'm shocked. Honestly, I'm shocked.
For the most part, most people anyway abroad, we're from Europe, most of us thought he was guilty. Most of us think he is guilty.
I mean, we all kind of saw it coming, didn't we? But it's like, it's actually happened now, so mad.
I think it's a little bit strange. I wish that it hadn't had to happen like that, but I think justice is always going to be served.
I wasn't surprised, but I'd be very surprised if he gets any serious time off the back of it.
and more specifically, a lot of the people we spoke to very interested to see how the election is going to pan out, and of course, his sentencing. We're live from Times Square. Zinnia Maldonado, CBS 2 News.
Okay, Zinnia, thank you.
CBS 2's Alice Gaynor was one of about 60 journalists with a seat in the main courtroom, and she has been there every day of this trial, which began on April 15th.
And she joins us now live. Alice, I'm wondering, a couple hours and a half or so since the verdict, what are your thoughts at the moment?
Well, I want to point out, you may notice behind me, the metal barricades are now gone from in front of the courthouse. NYPD officers have been removing them as of a short time ago, so things feel quiet here. There were some protesters in the park. People seem to be dispersing right now. A lot of crews, media here from all over the world. Now, it was very interesting in court today because around 4:14, the judge came in and said, I'm going to give the jury a few more moments and then I'm going to dismiss them at 4:30. All of a sudden, he came back in a little after 4:30, and I was wondering, gosh, it's after 4:30. Shouldn't they be dismissed now? He said, I have a note from the jury, and the note was dated with a timestamp of 4:20 this afternoon. It said that the jury had reached a verdict, but they were requesting 30 more minutes to fill out the verdict sheet, the proper forms. So we couldn't believe it. There was an audible gasp when the judge read that note because, again, everyone had sent their updates and posted that the jury had no verdict today and they were going to be sent home. And then all of a sudden that note came in, and it had been pretty quiet in the courtroom all day. There was one note this morning, and that was to clarify a note from yesterday. The jury was requesting readback of the judge's instructions, in particular page 6 to about 36. So about 30 pages were read back of the 55-page instruction. I spoke with a retired judge who's been in the courtroom every day observing this trial. I wanted to know his thoughts on what the jury requested in their notes, and he thought that that was very telling. They were requesting testimony readback of Michael Cohen and also of David Pecker, namely the 2015 Trump Tower meeting with Trump, during which Pecker, on the stand, testified he volunteered to be the eyes and ears of the Trump campaign. The other thing they requested this morning, headphones. They wanted to be able to better hear the audio evidence that was submitted because they were working off of a laptop. This laptop had no Wi-Fi. The only thing on it were all of the exhibits so that while they were deliberating in the jury room, they could pull up all of these different things. So the judge said they could get headphones and they could also get speakers so that they could all hear this. The one thing they don't have the transcript. So anytime they wanted to hear back testimony, they were brought back in this morning, and two court reporters, stenographers, assumed the roles of Michael Cohen, David Pecker. Actors they are not. So one of them had a very thick New York accent, and we were hearing them read back this testimony that Cohen gave on the stand and that David Pecker gave on the stand as well. So after the readback this morning, all quiet. We went through lunch. We came back this afternoon, and again, we thought they were going to be done for the day, and then, lo and behold, end of the day, verdict.
Alice, you know, the DA and both the judge mentioned how important the jury's work was in this case. The DA thanking the jury, the judge saying how stressful this was for every member of the jury. You mentioned that when they returned to the courtroom after reaching their verdict, that they did not look at the former president. I'm curious, though, once they were finished reading the verdicts and once that was all complete in the courtroom, what was their demeanor like then? Did they have a sense of relief that this was over, or did they still look as serious and as attentive as they always have since day one of this case?
Christine, total poker face. I mean, throughout this trial, occasionally we'd see them smile if an attorney sort of cracked a joke, but really could not get a read on any of them. That's how serious they were taking this case. So when they got up and they were dismissed, no expression on their faces that I could see. They were going back to the jury room, and the judge was going to thank them properly for their service. He thanked them in the courtroom, but the judge mentioned he was going to go back, he was going to talk to them. He was also going to get their feedback on the proceeding and, you know, any criticisms, any critiques, any suggestions for for running things better, I suppose, in the courtroom, he was going to ask them as well. It's an anonymous jury, so we don't know their names. The attorneys on both sides do, but the public, the press, we do not. And it's believed they exited out the back. Perhaps they were taken away in a van, but we have not spoken to any of these jurors yet.
One final thought here, Alice. After listening to every last detail and morsel of this trial, and now it's over. What are you left with? What are you left with? What are your thoughts at this moment?
Well, I can resume my sleep schedule, but I will say, you know, this ran like any other criminal proceeding I've seen here in this courthouse. Yes, this was the former president, but when you take someone out of their element and you put them in this courtroom, it's just something that makes them seem so human. So in a lot of ways, this felt like I was watching any other proceeding I've seen here in this courthouse. And I have to say, professionalism, these court officers, I mean, they really kept everyone in line, orderly, and they kept everyone safe.
So interesting. Alice Gaynor, thanks for the reporting and the insight. Truly appreciate it. Thanks.
We are going to take a quick break right now, and on the other side, we'll have a final word from our political and legal analysts about what comes next.
Welcome back. We're joined with our team here, Marcia Kramer, our political reporter, and James Sample, professor of law at Hofstra. Marcia is poring over the latest emails that are coming in. These are literally Trump supporter directed emails, fundraisers, and they're coming at a pretty high clip.
Well, not only that, but he's just announced that tomorrow at 11 o'clock at Trump Tower, I hate to do this because now he's going to get more people, but he's going to speak about what happened. This is now the 5th time that he sent out a press release since 5:21 minutes after he was convicted. But he's been sending out fundraising letter after fundraising letter, and he's also sending out other press releases saying he's being supported by people all over the country with quotes from his Republican supporters. So this is an ongoing thing as he tries to monetize the fact that he's been convicted. And
well,
I think
the House Speaker has commented about the conviction today, as many of his allies have in Washington, D.C.
Elise Stefanik, almost every political person that wants to get in his team has commented. People who want to run for vice president have commented. All of his supporters. But I think the key thing here that he is really trying to monetize this so that he can make money to run for president. And not only that, but I also have a question wondering whether he can use any of his campaign funds, I think you could probably answer that, to pay for his legal bills, which have clearly mounted to the millions of dollars. And I believe that he can use campaign funds to do that. So that's why he's in this big push, because he's going to mount not only appeals, which are expensive, but then he's going to need money to run against Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that he's been fundraising off of this, and that the fundraising has often been sort of there's a diversion of some of that money, and it goes into the Trump legal defense, which, if you're a part of his campaign, defending him against these charges is certainly relevant and germane to the campaign. But it is a telling state of affairs when the fundraising for the President of the United States is being used in part to pay for a legal defense in criminal cases. Well, that's not a great sign for...
Yeah, but you know, you have to understand one thing. He's using it by saying he's a political prisoner, and therefore people should contribute to him. And I think it's really interesting that he is now starting to campaign again tomorrow morning in front of Trump Tower, that he's going to try to use this again as another fundraising thing and a big campaign event.
Yeah, not surprising, since grievance is at the heart of a lot of what he does out there on the campaign trail. We were also remarking during the break about how, I don't know if we can show the video of him leaving Trump Tower, but it's kind of a full circle moment when he came down that escalator at Trump Tower back in the 2016 campaign, and now to go back home and leave the building again after being convicted on 34 counts today.
What a difference 9 years can make, right? I mean, it's really extraordinary to think about the journey, and the nation has been there every step of the way. I mean, there's not been a lack of attention paid to Donald Trump over the last decade for very good reasons, but it is a striking juxtaposition to think about going down that escalator, a crowd of adoring fans, and I'm sure they'll try and recreate some of that tomorrow politically for the visuals of it, but it's a very different circumstance for sure.
All right, Professor Sample from Hofstra Law, appreciate it. Marcia Kramer, as always, thanks for the insight. We're going to continue our coverage here of the aftermath of Donald Trump being convicted here, all 34 counts. We'll bring you the latest from the main players in the case, as well as reaction from New Yorkers just like you, coming up at 8 o'clock right here on CBS2 WLNY as well.
Stay right here. Extended coverage continues.
This is CBS 2 News at 8.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupting. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man.
Breaking right now at 8. An historic night for the nation as Donald Trump becomes the first former U.S. president convicted of felony crimes. From reaction across the tri-state area to the impact on the presidential election, we have live team coverage for you. Good evening. I'm Maurice Dubois.
And I'm Christine Johnson. Jurors in Trump's hush money trial found him guilty on all 34 counts.
That jury, made up of 7 men and 5 women, sided with prosecutors who said Trump violated the law by falsifying business records to cover up a $130,000 payment to the adult film star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 election.
And not long after the verdict was read, the former president left the courthouse in Lower Manhattan and arrived at Trump Tower. A large crowd was there waiting for him. And within the last hour, we saw Trump's motorcade leave Trump Tower once again. But it is unclear right now where he is headed. We do know that the former president is scheduled for an event tomorrow morning here in the city.
So what's next in the case? Trump is scheduled to be sentenced on July 11th at 10 a.m. We've got a team of reporters covering every angle of this historic verdict. Let's begin at the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where CBS 2's Dick Brennan and Alice Gaynor are standing by. Dick and Alice, good evening to you.
Good evening to you, Maurice and Christine. And Alice and I have literally been watching the cordon being drawn down. I mean, we just saw the gates go, right?
Yeah, the NYPD, they've been out here. They've been removing those metal barricades that have been in front of the courthouse for the entire trial, a sign that things here will go back to, should we say, normal.
Hard to believe, because it was just a few hours ago, Alice, you were sitting in that courtroom in one of the most dramatic moments in jurisprudence in American history. I don't think I'm overstating that. A former president literally being found guilty. What was that precise moment like when the verdict was read?
It was surprising, not because they reached a verdict, but because the judge had just told us at about, 4:14 that I'm going to give the jury a few more minutes, because typically they end the day at 4:30, and then I'm going to dismiss them. Right. So everyone is reporting, sending updates. The jury doesn't have a verdict today. They're going to be dismissed. And then all of a sudden, it's 4:30, and we're still not leaving the courtroom. The judge came in a little after 4:30, said, I received a note at 4:20 from the jury. They have reached a verdict. They would like 30 more minutes to fill out the forms. So people audibly gasped in the courtroom. Again, not because there was a verdict, but because we thought everyone was going home. So that was surprising.
And when those words were read, I mean, what was I know you couldn't precisely see what the former president looked like, but you saw him as he started to walk out. What was his demeanor?
So when he walked out after the verdict was read, he was red in the face and he looked very angry. He reached for his son Eric's hand. I don't know if he quite shook his hand or what that gesture was, but he walked out scowling and he was sweating.
Right.
And he's talked about the temperature in the courtroom quite a bit. Right. It was comfortable today. It wasn't freezing, it wasn't warm because it's varied. It was the right temperature, but he was sweating.
What about the jury?
The jury, they have had such a poker face this entire trial. They had no tells, they had no visible expressions, and when they walked out, it was hard to tell. I don't know what they felt when they went back to that jury room. I mean, this has consumed their life all these weeks. I mean, they've had to, it's hard to tell if people in their life, their colleagues and family kind of figured out which trial they were sitting on. It's an anonymous jury, so we don't know their names.
And in addition to the press, a lot of people sitting there, some former judges are in there that I know you spoke to today.
That's right. There's a retired criminal court judge here in New York, George Grasso, and he has been in that courtroom every day. He has an center aisle seat. He has a clear view. I spoke with him after today's verdict because I wanted to know his reaction, what he thought about the 2 days of deliberations, then a verdict, and the certain things the jury had asked for.
They absorbed the evidence. They asked the right questions. When they got their readback, they wanted to make sure they had the rules of the road correctly. When they brought in the David Pecker testimony and the Michael Cohen testimony regarding the now infamous Trump Tower organization, it's obvious they believe they got the corroboration they needed on Michael Cohen. I thought David Pecker was a very strong witness, and I thought those readbacks were quite ominous.
frustrating, I think.
Because about an hour or so this morning was spent doing testimony readback, like he mentioned, of Michael Cohen and David Pecker, and then also the judge reread some of his instructions to the jury, and then we didn't hear from them all day.
And now the big question, I think, is what happens next. We know the Trump team already said they're going to appeal, and that certainly could be a drawn-out process, right?
Mm-hmm. And the former president spoke right after, you know, he walked out angry, but he did stop like he usually does, and he spoke to those courtroom cameras.
Yeah, and I spoke to Arthur Aidala, who doesn't work for Trump per se, but he's been in touch with the team. He told me today that there's going to be a lot to appeal. Let's listen.
I think the real hard part for this judge is going to be to craft a sentence that makes sense. He can't give him, what's he going to give him, probation? This guy's followed by Secret Service all the time. It usually takes about a year. A year from today, maybe they'll be arguing the appeal, and then there is no time limit as to when they get the decision.
Both on his social media and comments.
So you heard him, he said it usually takes a year, which means this carries past the presidential election. And let's face it, this was the one trial of the four that Trump might have been facing that could have gotten done in time for the presidential election. It did, but as we know, we've got a sentencing in July.
July 11th,
July
10 a.m.
4 days before the Republican National Convention, and we know that Trump is already planning things tomorrow. So he's going to position pivot pretty quickly to a campaign.
There was one interesting moment. The judge stopped and said, "What about bail status?" And the prosecution was like, "There's no bail."
Yeah.
So that was a moment there.
And Alvin Bragg said tonight, he was asked, "Okay, are you going to recommend prison time?" And he, of course, said he didn't want to go there today. And he said, "You know what? Let's wait and see. We're going to have our proposal, but that's going to be coming in the next month." And something tells me you'll be sitting here on July 11th for sure.
Yeah, and talking about the jury and the tremendous pressure they must have been facing and feeling. And again, we don't know. We have not spoken to them. They're anonymous. But just thinking back to jury selection and how many people were dismissed because they felt they couldn't be fair and impartial, right. And also the stress and anxiety. We heard a few people start crying just during the selection process because they couldn't take the stress of it all. So you have to really hand it to these jurors because they kept their composure, they were here on time, they were taking notes, and they did their service.
And they did their service, and that's what people say about New York jurors. They listen to the judge and they listen to the law. Unfortunately, they had to listen to everything around here too, and that's part of the pressure that you're talking about. And that's not going to get any less. That's going to get worse, correct?
So it's up to them now if they want to speak out and talk to any press. Again, they were anonymous. The attorneys knew their names. We did not. We know some of their occupations. There was a teacher, two attorneys on the jury, and though they were not criminal attorneys, a civil litigator and a corporate attorney.
Right.
And one of them said, when they were being selected, I don't know much about.
Right. He said, I don't know anything about criminal law, which is very different. Well, incredible job, Alice Gaynor in the courtroom, and Maurice and Christine, back to you.
Great work, you guys. Thank you for the insight. Appreciate it.
Joining us here in studio is CBS 2 political reporter Marcia Kramer and also professor of law at Hofstra University, James Sample, here for this historic day for New York and also really for our country. Professor, I'd like to start with you. The jury had to look at 34 separate counts. Every single one of them, they found the former president guilty. What does that tell you about the prosecution's case?
Well, the prosecution had a very strong case here, Christine, and I think the fact that the jury was very careful. You analyze the particular questions they asked to have and the testimony they asked to have read back to them. This was a jury that took their job very seriously. They had a serious job to do, and they did that job. They did it well. They did it carefully. I think the fact that they were unanimous across the board on all 34 counts indicates a couple of things. One, the counts are somewhat duplicative of each other, right? There are 11 separate checks. Each of those separate checks is a count, right? That's a falsified record that Donald Trump signed, the invoices, etc. Each of those. So there's some duplication to start with, but the fact that this is all 34 counts, guilty as charged, as you say, that's an indication that the prosecution was thorough, did their job, and that the jury looked very carefully. And, to come back in 2 days with that verdict indicates they were pretty convinced.
What do you think about the work of the defense team? How'd they do?
They were in a tough spot. I think they were uneven. Certainly the closing remarks, the closing summations a couple of days ago, there was a dramatic difference in the comfort level with the theatrics of the courtroom and the ease of the closing statements on the part of the prosecutors, who were Joshua Steinglass, who was just tremendous. Todd Blanche, for the former president, was a little uneven. To be clear, though, The defense counsel had a tough job for multiple reasons. Reason number one, they didn't have the evidence on their side. Reason number two, their client is famously difficult. Oftentimes, the defense counsel here had to play not to an audience of 12, the jury, but to an audience of 1, their client.
Right. Tough spot. Okay, Marsha, what about the politics here? I know there's so many ways you can come at this, but let's start with the fact that will this move the needle? A lot of people, you know, he's convicted. Are people still going to vote for him? Does this change the balance of the election?
Well, as we've talked about, it really depends on what happens in 7 battleground states, where before this happened, Trump was ahead, according to the polls, in 5 of the 7 states. But CBS News polling had indicated that if there was a conviction in battleground states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, as many as 15% of the voters said they might change their mind, which gives wiggle room for President Biden. But there's another thing I want to talk to you about. I was just looking, you know, the Trump campaign has been putting out all manner of stuff all evening, and they just put out a very long list of people who are, you know, complaining about the fact that he was convicted. And of course, there are notable people who are running who want to be vice president. There's also people like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. But interestingly enough, there were only 2 New Yorkers on the list. Not surprising, Elise Stefanik, but also Anthony D'Esposito, a congressman who's going to have a really tough race in Long Island to get reelected. But interestingly to me is that, you know, there are 5 or 6 really key races where freshman Republicans in Congress won and helped turn and flip the House to the Republicans. Only one of those people, D'Esposito, is on the list supporting Trump. Now, I'm sure the others are going to have to say they support Trump too, but it's interesting that they're not immediately wrapping their arms around him because they have tough races and Democrats are going to go after them.
In swing districts.
In swing districts.
Okay.
Good point there, Marsha. Thank you.
All right.
This was a major case for the prosecution and Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg.
CBS 2's Tim McNicholas live in Lower Manhattan with what the DA, Alvin Bragg, had to say. Tim.
Maurice and Christine, we've heard it for months now. Trump and his allies have tried to paint this as a case that they say is completely unfair. DA Bragg, in complete contrast to that, very deliberately today tried to describe this as a case that he says he handled just like he would have any other. He said this is the kind of white-collar prosecution that is at the core of what his office does day in and day out. He also at least twice described the jury as, quote, everyday jurors or everyday New Yorkers. Here's what he said earlier.
Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election.
And DA Bragg only took a few questions today. He was very measured in his response to those questions. For one, he was asked if he has any response to the criticism and insults that Trump and his team have thrown at him throughout this entire process. To that, he simply replied, no, I did not. Now, he was also asked if he will request prison time for Trump as part of his sentencing. To that, he simply said that the judge has scheduled a sentencing for July, and Bragg and his prosecution team will speak up in court at that time. If today is any indication, then there's no doubt that people all over the country will be tuning in, listening, watching, reading very closely to see what they say in court at that time. Christina, Maurice.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. Well, crowds gathered in Times Square today after that verdict.
CBS 2's Zania Maldonado has been there since the verdict was read, listening to what people are saying there tonight. Zania?
Well, as you know, Maurice and Christine, there's folks from everywhere here in Times Square, all across the city, state, country, the world even. And everyone had something to say about a U.S. former president being convicted of a crime for the very first time. Some were shocked, others not shocked. But a common denominator amongst all of the folks we spoke to is that they're really going to be looking to see how this all plays out in the long term. Take a listen.
It's insane. That's never happened before in history. So this is something that we're living, and I don't even know how this is going to turn out. I'm shocked. Honestly, I'm shocked.
For the most part, most people anyway abroad, we're from Europe, most of us thought he was guilty. Most of us think he is guilty.
I mean, we all kind of saw it coming, didn't we? But it's like, it's actually happened now, so mad.
I think it's a little bit strange. I wish that it hadn't had to happen like that, but I think justice is always going to be served.
I wasn't surprised, but I'd be very surprised if he gets any serious time off the back of it.
And a lot of folks very interested to see, like many of us, how this sentencing is going to play out over the next couple of weeks. And of course, the election. We're live from Times Square. Zania Maldonado, CBS 2 News.
Okay, Zania, thank you.
We're going to have much more on the historic guilty verdict for Donald Trump coming up in our next half hour. You can also find updates anytime on our website, cbsnewyork.com. And we'll be right back.
A Brooklyn man who police say tried to run down students outside their Jewish school is now facing charges.
The Neighborhood Safety Patrol team says it alerted police to the driver's location before the arrest. They recounted those critical moments to CBS 2 investigative reporter Tim McNicholas.
LWS. This video shows students calling out the plate number of this fleeing car just after the person behind the wheel drove in front of their yeshiva on Glenwood Road as rabbis and students ran out of the way.
I actually answered that call.
Stephen Weil of the Flatbush Shamram Safety Patrol relayed that plate number to his team.
We let all our members know that this car is probably in the area, so keep your eyes open.
Sure enough, Weil says they spotted the car parked about a mile away, alerted police, and watched it from a distance until the NYPD arrived and arrested the driver. Witnesses say he'd yelled violent, anti-Semitic statements at students and rabbis.
Police say the driver is a 58-year-old man named Ali Asghar. You can still see the tire marks where police say he drove in front of the school.
We hear more and more of this every single day. This is close to home as you're going to get. So it's not shocking. Unfortunately, it's not shocking.
NYPD data shows police responded to 86 anti-Semitic hate crimes by this time last year. So far this year, 131.
This is a random act of violence. I believe it was a hate crime. It's been investigated now as such. And this person is dealing with some serious mental health issues based on a preliminary report.
Oscar is facing 12 charges, including attempted murder as a hate crime. Weil says students and rabbis are okay physically.
They're shook up. I'm sure that they want to add some security here.
Tim McNicholas, CBS 2 investigates.
All right, let's check your first alert forecast. Lonnie Quinn is here, and hopefully the rain is out of here.
Yeah, okay, that's gone now, and in its wake, we have just beautiful air in place. I mean, yeah, there are a couple of clouds out there right now. Temperatures coming in at 68, but the rain that Maurice is referring to, all part of that front that came through, scoured the atmosphere. Look at how healthy the air quality is right now. I mean, it is just great outside, but it was a soaker. Biggest numbers, okay, out of this heavy round of rain that we had come through on Wednesday and part of it into Thursday morning, early this morning. West Caldwell, Cedar Grove, picking up 2 inches of rain. Woodsville, New Jersey, 1.5 inches. Hastings-on-Hudson, 1.25 inches. Central Park, 0.83. Now, most of that, the lion's share, fell on Wednesday, 0.65. About 0.2 fell early this morning. But look at all of this. All the days shaded in green gave you some kind of rain. All right, it's almost exactly half. We've had 13 days that have been wet outside, and when you add it all up, it comes to 4.11 inches of rain for the month of May. We'd been running below average for May, and April was well below average. March was above average, but now May, with this reading right there, we now have a surplus of 0.4 of an inch of rain. Is there more rain out there? No, we talk about how, boy, there's that very slight chance to see something come through tonight, but it's sort of faded. The low pressure now east of Nantucket, so it plays out like this. For tonight, 56 degrees, a stray shower chance is a very minimal chance. We're on the cool side, though, some 40s north and west. And then as you get into your day tomorrow, everything just goes dark. No, it's because the sun's going to set. It will be this. This is what happens when the computer crashes. Hey, it's coming back. Here we go. All right, I'll step this way. Cage, I needed my tap dancing shoes, and I didn't have them. Across the board, guys, this is what I do want to get at. It's a great run of weather. Tomorrow, 77 with sunshine, low humidity, 80 on Saturday, 82 Sunday, 81 Monday. We're still going strong, 82 Tuesday.
Wow,
later Wednesday into Thursday, the next chance for some rain.
So we've been locked in the studio for 90 minutes.
Yeah, I've been standing in the dark for about 5 seconds.
I understand, but we don't know whether it's light or dark outside. No. So what is it?
Was that a live picture that you showed?
It was a live picture.
So it's light out.
Listen, let's be real.
We literally have no idea.
Let's be real. It's 8:22, right? This is about sunset time,
okay.
So you still have some dusky conditions.
But we're in the dark. Just for the record.
I looked at Maurice. I said, is that a live picture?
So I don't know. It is. We've been in the studio.
Imagine that. Yeah.
Thank you, Lonnie.
And by the way, you guys are doing some great work up here.
Thank you, Lonnie.
Thanks, Lonnie.
Appreciate that. All right, coming up here ahead tonight, the Rangers, they are trying to make their way to the Stanley Cup Finals after last night's OT loss. We'll have that, and we'll be right back.